You have been taught to fight what hurts, to question what ended, and to chase answers from things that may never speak back. But if fighting reality brought peace, why do you still feel tired? Why does the past still pull at your heart? Why does your mind keep returning to what cannot be changed, as if thinking about it one more time will finally make life different? The truth is, accepting what you cannot change is not weakness. It is the beginning of inner freedom. Buddhism has always known this. Pain becomes heavier when the mind argues with it. Loss becomes deeper when the heart refuses to release it. And life becomes harder when you keep demanding a different ending from something that has already happened. Tonight, as you listen to these teachings, something inside you will begin to loosen. The need to control everything will soften. The old questions will not feel as loud, and the weight you have carried for too long will start to feel lighter. Slowly, you will understand that peace is not found by forcing life to change, but by learning how to meet life as it is, with a calm mind and an open heart. This is not just a lesson about acceptance. This is the path to inner freedom. Are you ready? Let's begin. And this is where the real journey begins, because acceptance is not only about letting go of pain. It is about seeing the hidden war happening inside your mind every single day. Most people think suffering only comes from what happened to them, but Buddhism teaches something far deeper. A large part of suffering comes from refusing to accept that something has already happened. Tonight, you are going to understand why arguing with reality quietly drains your peace, your energy, and your ability to feel alive. And once you truly see it, you may never look at your struggles the same way again. There is a kind of violence that leaves no bruises on the skin, yet destroys people from the inside every single day. It happens silently. No one sees it. No ambulance comes for it. No one talks about it at family dinners. But it exhausts millions of people across the world. It is the violence of arguing with reality. It begins the moment life does not go the way you wanted. Someone leaves. A dream collapses. Your body changes. A betrayal happens. An opportunity disappears. And instead of grieving it, instead of slowly accepting what is already true, the mind starts fighting reality itself. This should not have happened. They should have treated me differently. My life was supposed to look different. If only I had said something else. If only I had one more chance. And without realizing it, many people spend years emotionally wrestling with moments that no longer exist. That is one of the deepest teachings in Buddhism. Pain is natural, but resistance multiplies suffering. The event hurts once, but the mind repeats the hurt thousands of times by refusing to let reality be what it already is. It is almost like reopening the same wound every morning just to check if it still hurts. And the strange part is that most people do not even notice they are doing this. They think they are thinking deeply. They think they are trying to fix things, but often they are simply trapped in a mental argument with life itself. Think about how exhausting that is. Reality keeps moving forward while your mind keeps dragging you backward. Life says, "It happened." The mind says, "But it should not have." Life says, "It is over." The mind says, "But I need another ending." Life says, "This person changed." The mind says, "But I need them to become who I wanted." This constant inner conflict slowly drains your spirit. Not all at once, but little by little, like water leaking from a cracked container. Many people are not tired because life is impossible. They are tired because their minds are constantly fighting things they cannot change. Buddhism teaches that reality does not bend simply because the mind refuses to accept it. The rain still falls, people still leave, bodies still age, death still comes, change still happens. And this is where suffering becomes dangerous. Because when the mind cannot control reality, it often starts attacking itself instead. That is why some people become bitter after heartbreak. Others become anxious after failure. Others spend decades angry at their childhood, their parents, or even themselves. They believe they are fighting the past, but the past is already gone. What they are really fighting is the inability to accept that the past cannot be rewritten. That realization hurts at first, because part of the ego believes that if it keeps suffering long enough, reality will eventually apologize. But life rarely apologizes the way people hope it will. Sometimes there is no explanation. Sometimes there is no closure. Sometimes there is no justice that feels satisfying. Sometimes people hurt you and continue sleeping peacefully at night. Sometimes you give your heart to someone who cannot hold it carefully. Sometimes good people lose things they never deserved to lose. And this is where many minds begin breaking themselves apart, not because pain exists, but because they cannot stop arguing with the fact that pain exists. The Buddha taught that attachment creates suffering, but many people misunderstand what that means. Attachment is not only attachment to people or possessions. Sometimes the deepest attachment is attachment to how life was supposed to go. That expectation becomes a prison. A person says, "I was supposed to be loved by now. I was supposed to be successful by now. My family was supposed to understand me. My life was supposed to be easier." And when reality does not match the story in the mind, frustration begins growing like weeds in a neglected garden. This is why two people can experience the exact same event, yet suffer differently. One person experiences loss and slowly grieves. The other experiences loss and mentally fights it every day for 10 years. One accepts change. The other keeps demanding the old version of life back. One allows pain to move through them. The other builds an identity around resisting it. And eventually, resistance becomes heavier than the original pain itself. There are people still emotionally living inside arguments from 20 years ago, still replaying conversations, still trying to mentally defend themselves against people who may not even remember the situation anymore. That is the quiet violence of refusing reality. It chains your nervous system to moments that no longer exist. Your body continues living in the present while your mind stays emotionally trapped in another time. And slowly, peace disappears. You see it everywhere. Someone cannot accept aging, so they become obsessed with trying to look younger every year, terrified of every wrinkle as if time itself is an enemy. Someone cannot accept rejection, so they keep chasing people who clearly no longer want them. Someone cannot accept uncertainty, so they overthink every detail of life until their own thoughts exhaust them. Someone cannot accept imperfection, so they spend their lives feeling inadequate no matter how much they achieve. Underneath all of it is the same hidden struggle. Reality did not match the mind's demands. Buddhism does not teach people to stop caring about life. It teaches people to stop destroying themselves, fighting what already exists. That is very different. Acceptance is not saying pain feels good. Acceptance is saying, this is what is here right now. And strangely, that simple shift changes everything, because when the mind finally stops screaming at reality, energy becomes available again. You can breathe again. You can think clearly again. You can sleep without mentally replaying every mistake. You stop carrying the impossible burden of trying to undo what cannot be undone. One of the hardest truths to accept is that reality does not need your agreement to be real. A storm does not stop because you dislike it. A breakup does not reverse because you cannot accept it. A person does not suddenly become emotionally healthy because you loved them deeply. Life simply continues. At first, this sounds harsh, but hidden inside it is freedom. Because once you stop demanding reality become something else, you can finally meet life honestly instead of constantly resisting it. And honesty is where healing begins. Many people think healing means erasing pain, But Buddhism often points towards something gentler and wiser. Healing is learning how to stop turning pain into permanent inner war. There is a huge difference between feeling sadness and becoming consumed by resistance to sadness. A huge difference between grief and refusing to let grief move naturally. A huge difference between remembering pain and worshipping pain. The mind that constantly argues with reality eventually becomes addicted to suffering, because suffering creates the illusion of control. If I keep thinking about it, maybe I can fix it. If I keep replaying it, maybe I can change it. If I keep hurting over it, maybe it will somehow become different. But reality remains unmoved. And this is why acceptance feels terrifying to many people. They confuse acceptance with defeat. They think accepting reality means approving of it. But those are not the same thing at all. You can accept that someone hurt you without saying what they did was okay. You can accept a loss without pretending you wanted it. You can accept the ending of something without denying the love you felt. Acceptance simply means you. Stop demanding reality become different before allowing yourself to heal. That is where peace begins entering the body again. Not when life becomes perfect, not when every answer arrives, not when every wound disappears, but when the inner war slowly quiets down. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for reality to become comfortable before they allow themselves to feel peace. But peace was never hiding inside perfect circumstances. Peace appears when the mind stops resisting the truth of the present moment, and that takes courage. Real courage is not controlling everything around you. Real courage is sitting quietly with reality without needing to escape it, numb it, deny it, or rewrite it. That is why Buddhist monks spend so much time observing the mind, because they understand something most people miss. A restless mind creates endless suffering, even inside comfortable lives. You can have money and still suffer, relationships and still suffer, success and still suffer, because external comfort cannot free a mind addicted to resistance. A person can move to another city and still carry the same inner chaos, find another partner and still repeat the same emotional patterns, achieve success and still feel empty afterward. Why? Because the deepest suffering was never only outside them, it was inside the constant battle against reality itself. And maybe this explains why some people become calmer after enormous hardship, while others become permanently bitter from smaller pain. The calmer person eventually stopped arguing with what happened. The bitter person kept demanding another past. This does not mean acceptance happens overnight. Sometimes acceptance comes in tiny pieces. First, the mind softens, then the body relaxes. Then the endless replaying slowly decreases. Then one day, you notice the memory no longer controls your entire nervous system. You remember, but you are no longer trapped inside remembering. That is healing, not forgetting, not pretending, not becoming emotionless, but finally allowing reality to exist without fighting it every second. And something surprising happens after that. Life begins feeling lighter, not because problems disappear, but because you stop carrying the extra weight created by resistance. A difficult truth becomes easier to hold once you stop demanding it become something else. Even grief changes shape when it is no longer mixed with resistance. There are people who lost someone they deeply loved, yet eventually found peace. Not because the loss stopped mattering, but because they stopped mentally screaming against the fact that it happened. That does not erase love. If anything, it honors love more honestly. Because love does not need denial to remain meaningful. The same is true for regret. Everyone has moments they wish they could change. Things they should have said. Risks they should have taken. Warnings they ignored. Versions of themselves they no longer recognize. But there comes a moment where healing asks a painful question. How long will you punish yourself for being human? because no amount of guilt can rewrite time, and no amount of self-hatred can heal the past. At some point, the mind must stop placing itself on trial every day. This is one reason Buddhist teachings emphasize compassion so deeply. Not only compassion for others, but compassion toward your own imperfect humanity. You were always going to make mistakes. You were always going to misunderstand some things too late. You were always going to outgrow old versions of yourself. That is part of being alive. And perhaps true inner freedom begins the moment you stop demanding perfection from a life that was always temporary, uncertain, and changing. Reality was never designed to obey the ego's fantasies. People change, bodies age, plans collapse, emotions rise and fall. Nothing stays fixed forever. At first, this truth feels uncomfortable, but eventually it becomes strangely liberating. Because once you stop expecting permanence from temporary things, you stop being shocked every time life changes. You begin flowing with life instead of constantly resisting it, like water moving around stones instead of trying to destroy them. And maybe that is what wisdom really is. Not becoming invincible, not controlling every outcome, not escaping pain forever, but learning how to remain soft inside a world that constantly changes. A soft mind survives reality better than a rigid one. A flexible tree bends during storms while stiff branches snap. The same is true emotionally. People who cannot accept change often break under it. People who slowly learn acceptance become more peaceful, even in uncertainty. Not because life stops being difficult, but because they stop fighting every difficult moment as if reality personally betrayed them. And perhaps tonight, this is what your heart most needs to hear. You do not need to solve your entire life right now. You do not need to force every answer. You do not need to mentally wrestle every painful memory until sunrise. Some things happened, some things ended. Some questions may remain unanswered. And despite all of that, peace is still possible, not through control, not through endless overthinking, but through slowly releasing the argument with reality itself. Because the moment the war inside your mind begins quieting down, inner freedom quietly begins appearing in its place. And slowly, this is where the mind begins to face one of its deepest fears. Because once you stop arguing with reality, another question immediately appears. If I accept this, does that mean I am giving up? That question scares many people more than pain itself. And tonight you are going to understand why true acceptance is not weakness at all. In many ways, it is one of the strongest things a human being can ever learn to do. There is a strange misunderstanding that keeps many people emotionally trapped for years. They believe acceptance means becoming passive, weak, defeated. They think accepting reality means saying, nothing matters anymore. They confuse peace with surrender and softness with powerlessness. But Buddhism teaches something completely different. Acceptance is not giving up on life. Acceptance is giving up the exhausting fight against what is already real. That distinction changes everything, because many people are secretly at war with acceptance itself. They hold on to suffering because they believe letting go means they did not care deeply enough. They think moving forward dishonors the pain, the relationship, the dream, or the version of life they lost. So they continue carrying emotional weight long after the moment has passed, not because they want to suffer, but because suffering feels loyal. And this is one of the most heartbreaking traps the mind creates. A person loses someone they loved, and part of them believes healing would somehow betray the memory. Someone gets rejected, and they hold on to sadness because letting go feels like admitting defeat. Someone experiences failure, and instead of learning from it, they emotionally chain themselves to shame because they think self-punishment proves responsibility. But punishment is not wisdom. and suffering forever is not proof of love. Many people do not realize how much energy they waste trying to emotionally resist reality while pretending they are being strong. But there is nothing strong about constantly breaking your own heart with the same memory every day. There is nothing noble about mentally reliving pain until it becomes your identity. Real strength is something quieter. It is the ability to look honestly at what is true without collapsing under it. Buddhist teachings often speak about the difference between pain and attachment. Pain is part of life, but attachment to how things must be creates deeper suffering, and one of the strongest attachments people carry is attachment to control. The ego desperately wants life to obey its plans. It wants certainty, predictability, permanent happiness, permanent relationships, permanent success. But reality does not operate that way. Everything changes, everything moves, everything eventually transforms. And the moment life refuses to follow the mind's script, fear appears. That fear often whispers dangerous lies. If you accept this, you are weak. If you let go, you lose. If you stop fighting, they win. If you move on, it means it never mattered. So the mind keeps resisting reality even when the resistance is destroying inner peace. But Buddhism teaches that acceptance is not about approving pain, it is about seeing clearly. A person standing in a storm is not weak for admitting it is raining. A person grieving is not weak for admitting something ended. A person healing is not weak for admitting they cannot force another human being to love them correctly. That honesty is courage. Because denial is often easier than truth. Many people spend years pretending they are okay while quietly drowning inside. Others spend years pretending they are fighting when really they are just refusing to face reality honestly. But true acceptance requires enormous inner maturity. It asks you to stop hiding, stop bargaining, stop pretending, stop demanding another version of life before allowing yourself peace. That is not weakness, that is emotional bravery. There is a reason peaceful people often appear calmer than everyone else in difficult situations. It is not because life hurts them less. It is because they stopped resisting every painful truth as if reality personally attacked them. They understand something most people do not. Reality becomes lighter when you stop carrying resistance on top of pain. Think about someone trapped in quicksand. Panic makes them sink faster. Fighting wildly against the sand only pulls them deeper. The calmer they become, the more clearly they can move. The human mind works the same way. Panic clouds wisdom. Resistance clouds clarity. Desperation clouds judgment. Acceptance creates space to respond wisely instead of emotionally exploding against reality. This is why acceptance is deeply connected to peace. Not because peace means life becomes easy, but because the nervous system finally stops living in constant internal combat. There are people whose entire bodies are exhausted from fighting reality. Their shoulders stay tense. Their thoughts never slow down. Their sleep feels restless. Their emotions swing wildly between hope and fear. And underneath it all is one exhausting sentence: this should not be happening. That sentence quietly drains life from people, because reality does not stop existing simply because the mind refuses to welcome it. Aging still happens, loss still happens, change still happens, uncertainty still happens, and eventually the mind must choose between endless resistance or gradual acceptance. Not because acceptance feels emotionally easy, but because resistance eventually becomes unbearable. Many people fear acceptance because they think it means losing control. But ironically, acceptance is what finally allows you to regain control over yourself. Not control over life, not control over other people, not control over outcomes, but control over your own response. And that is where true power begins. Buddhism repeatedly teaches that suffering grows when the mind clings too tightly to things outside its control. This does not mean becoming emotionless. It means learning the difference between caring deeply and attaching your entire inner stability to temporary conditions. You can love someone deeply without controlling them. You can work hard without emotionally collapsing every time life changes direction. You can grieve honestly without letting grief consume your identity forever. This is the middle path Buddhism speaks about so often. Not extreme detachment, not obsessive attachment, but balanced awareness. Many people think acceptance means they stop trying altogether, but acceptance and effort are not enemies. A farmer accepts the seasons, yet still plants seeds. A sailor accepts the ocean cannot be controlled, yet still learns how to navigate waves wisely. A peaceful person accepts uncertainty, yet still continues building a meaningful life. Acceptance does not stop action, it stops emotional warfare against reality. And strangely, once the mind stops fighting reality, clearer action becomes possible. People trapped in resistance often make decisions from panic, fear, ego, or desperation. They chase unavailable people, force impossible situations, destroy their peace trying to control outcomes. But acceptance allows wiser movement. You begin responding instead of reacting. You stop begging life to become something else before allowing yourself dignity. And this is where acceptance becomes deeply empowering instead of passive. Because the moment you stop emotionally wrestling reality, your energy returns, not all at once, but slowly. The mental noise decreases, the obsession softens, the emotional exhaustion eases, and suddenly you can see possibilities that resistance kept hiding from you. Many people delay healing because they secretly believe acceptance means the story is over. But often, acceptance is what finally allows a new chapter to begin. A person cannot heal from a breakup while constantly pretending the relationship still exists. A person cannot grow after failure while emotionally refusing to admit the failure happened. A person cannot adapt to change while demanding the past return exactly as it was. Reality must first be acknowledged before wisdom can emerge from it. This is why denial feels so heavy over time. It freezes emotional movement. Acceptance allows movement again, like water finally flowing after being trapped behind a blocked dam. There is also another misunderstanding about acceptance that causes suffering. Many people think acceptance means never feeling sadness, anger, or grief again. But Buddhism never teaches emotional numbness. It teaches non-attachment. That means emotions are allowed to exist without becoming permanent prisons. A peaceful person still feels disappointment, still feels sadness, still feels loss. But they no longer build an endless identity around those emotions. They let emotions move naturally instead of turning them into lifelong emotional residences. That takes wisdom. Because the human ego loves permanence. It wants emotional stories that explain everything forever. I am the abandoned one. I am the victim. I am the failure. I am the unloved person. But Buddhism gently asks a deeper question. What happens when you stop turning temporary pain into permanent identity? That question changes lives. Because many people are not only carrying pain, they are carrying stories about pain that they repeat so often the stories begin shaping their entire existence, and slowly they stop seeing themselves clearly. They become fused with suffering. Acceptance loosens that fusion. Not by denying pain, but by refusing to let pain define the entire self forever. This is why true acceptance often feels quieter than people expect. It is not dramatic, not loud, not performative. Sometimes it simply looks like a person finally taking a deep breath after years of emotional tension. Sometimes it looks like no longer checking a phone every 5 minutes hoping someone changes. Sometimes it looks like sitting peacefully with uncertainty instead of trying to force answers. Sometimes it looks like grieving honestly without needing revenge. Sometimes it looks like finally saying, "This hurts, but I no longer want to destroy myself fighting it." That moment is sacred, because it is the beginning of emotional freedom. And perhaps one of the hardest parts of acceptance is realizing life was never fully controllable to begin with. The mind wants guarantees. It wants certainty before peace. It says, "I will relax once everything is resolved. I will feel safe once life becomes predictable. I will feel peaceful once nobody disappoints me." But life cannot make those promises. No human being can guarantee permanent comfort. And if peace depends entirely on controlling external life perfectly, peace will always remain fragile. This is why Buddhism places so much attention on inner stability instead of outer perfection. Outer life will always change. People will misunderstand you sometimes. Plans will fail sometimes. Bodies will weaken eventually. Unexpected pain will appear. But inner freedom comes from learning how to remain emotionally grounded inside uncertainty instead of demanding uncertainty disappear forever. That is real strength. Not domination over life, but balance within life. And this strength often looks very different from what society praises. The world often celebrates aggression, control, emotional hardness, and endless ambition. But many people who appear powerful externally are collapsing internally. They cannot sit alone quietly. They cannot tolerate uncertainty. They cannot handle rejection without emotional destruction. They cannot accept change without panic. That is not strength. That is dependency disguised as confidence. A truly peaceful person does not need reality to obey them in order to remain centered. And that kind of peace cannot be purchased, forced, or performed. It is built slowly through acceptance, moment by moment, breath by breath, truth by truth. This does not mean life suddenly becomes painless. It means pain no longer completely controls the direction of your inner world. You stop becoming emotionally possessed by every difficult moment. You become softer without becoming weak, wiser without becoming cold, calmer without becoming detached from humanity. And perhaps this is why acceptance feels so misunderstood. Because from the outside, calmness can appear passive. But inside, tremendous inner work is happening. A person is resisting the urge to panic, resisting the urge to obsess, resisting the urge to emotionally chase control, resisting the urge to collapse into hopelessness. That is discipline, deep discipline, the kind that transforms lives quietly over time. And one day, something surprising happens. You realize acceptance did not take your power away. It returned your power to you, because now your peace no longer depends entirely on controlling every outcome. You can survive uncertainty. You can survive endings. You can survive disappointment, not because they stop hurting, but because you stop turning every painful experience into total inner destruction. That is what inner freedom begins to feel like. Not invulnerability, but flexibility, not perfection, but groundedness, not emotional numbness, but emotional wisdom. And maybe tonight, this is what your heart most needs to understand. Acceptance is not quitting on life. It is quitting the war against reality that has been quietly exhausting your soul for years. And the moment that war begins to end, something powerful begins returning to you. Your clarity, your energy, your dignity, your ability to breathe fully again. And perhaps for the first time in a long time, your ability to feel peace without needing life to become something different first. And as the inner war slowly begins to quiet down, another truth starts revealing itself. Acceptance is not only about learning how to face reality, It is also about learning how to feel pain without allowing that pain to become the entire definition of who you are. Because one of the greatest dangers of suffering is not only that it hurts, it is that over time the mind begins turning pain into identity. And tonight, you are going to understand why Buddhism teaches that pain may visit your life, but it was never meant to become your permanent self. There is a silent moment that changes many people forever, and most do not even realize when it happens. It is the moment pain stops being an experience and starts becoming an identity. At first, a person simply feels hurt. Then slowly, without noticing, they begin becoming the hurt person. Not someone experiencing grief, but someone who believes grief is now their entire existence. Not someone who went through rejection, but someone who believes they are permanently unlovable. Not someone who failed once, but someone who now sees themselves as failure itself. And this is where suffering becomes much deeper than the original wound. Because pain enters human life naturally, but identity holds the pain in place long after the moment has passed. Buddhism teaches something very important about the mind. The mind clings. It grabs onto experiences, labels, memories, emotions, and stories, then quietly says, "This is who I am now." That attachment becomes dangerous, because eventually the person no longer knows where the pain ends and where they begin. You see this everywhere in life. Someone experiences betrayal, and years later they still introduce themselves to the world through distrust. Someone loses a relationship, and afterward, every conversation becomes shaped by abandonment. Someone struggles emotionally, and slowly they stop seeing themselves as a human being going through pain and start seeing themselves only as the broken one. The tragedy is not only the pain itself. The tragedy is forgetting there is still a self underneath the pain. This is one reason Buddhist teachings place so much importance on awareness. Awareness creates distance between you and your suffering. Without awareness, emotions completely consume identity. With awareness, you begin realizing something life-changing. I am experiencing pain, but I am not pain itself. That single realization can completely transform the way a person heals. Because many people secretly believe that if they stop identifying with pain, their experiences will no longer matter. But Buddhism teaches the opposite. You can honor your suffering without worshipping it forever. There is a difference between acknowledging a wound and building your entire personality around bleeding. And sadly, modern life often encourages people to become trapped inside emotional identities. People repeat their pain story so often that it becomes the main way they relate to themselves and others. The mind says, "This happened to me, therefore this is who I am." But pain is an event, not a permanent identity. Clouds pass through the sky, but the sky itself remains. Emotions pass through the mind, but awareness remains beneath them. And this is one of the deepest forms of inner freedom Buddhism offers. The understanding that thoughts, feelings, wounds, fears, and grief are experiences moving through consciousness. They are not the total truth of who you are. This does not mean denying emotions. In fact, Buddhism encourages people to fully witness emotions instead of suppressing them. But witnessing is very different from becoming consumed. A peaceful person allows sadness to exist without turning sadness into their permanent self-image. A peaceful person allows grief to move naturally without making grief the center of their entire identity forever. That is emotional wisdom. Many people think healing means never hurting again. But healing is often much simpler and much gentler than that. Healing is learning how to carry pain without allowing it to swallow your identity whole. Because pain changes shape when the mind stops feeding it with endless self-definition. Think about how often people say things like, "I am anxious," "I am damaged," "I am unwanted," "I am ruined." And while those words may feel emotionally true in painful moments, the mind slowly absorbs them as identity. The person no longer experiences anxiety occasionally. They become the anxious person. They no longer experience heartbreak. They become the abandoned person. The wound stops being temporary and starts becoming personal identity. That is where suffering hardens. Buddhist teachings gently interrupt this process. They remind people that all inner experiences are temporary movements, not permanent definitions. Even intense emotions eventually shift. Fear changes, grief changes, anger changes, shame changes. Nothing emotional stays frozen forever unless the mind constantly rebuilds it through attachment and repetition. This is why awareness matters so deeply. The moment you become aware of pain without completely fusing with it, something powerful happens. Space appears between you and the suffering, not distance that removes humanity, but enough space to breathe again, enough space to observe instead of drown, enough space to realize this feeling is visiting me, but it is not the entirety of me. That space is sacred, because many people have spent years trapped in emotional identities they never consciously chose. Perhaps someone criticized them repeatedly as a child, and now they carry the identity of not being enough. Perhaps someone abandoned them, and now they carry the identity of being unwanted. Perhaps life disappointed them repeatedly, and now they carry the identity of being cursed. But identities built from pain are rarely accurate reflections of reality. They are survival stories created by wounded minds trying to make sense of suffering, and the mind becomes very attached to these stories because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. Even painful identities can feel emotionally comforting simply because they are known. A person who believes they are unworthy may unconsciously reject love because the old identity feels more familiar than happiness. A person who sees themselves as broken may resist healing because healing threatens the identity they have carried for years. This is why letting go of pain-based identity can feel frightening. Not because suffering feels good, but because the ego fears not knowing who it is without the suffering. And this is one of the most hidden fears in human life. Who am I without my pain? Who am I if I stop calling myself broken? Who am I if I stop defining myself by what happened to me? Many people never ask these questions deeply enough. Instead, they continue unconsciously protecting the very suffering they want to escape. Buddhism gently invites people into another way of seeing themselves, not as fixed identities, not as permanent emotional stories, but as constantly changing beings moving through temporary experiences, like rivers flowing instead of statues frozen in place. This perspective softens suffering tremendously. Because once identity becomes flexible, healing becomes possible. The person no longer says, "This is who I am forever." Instead, they begin saying, "This is what I am feeling right now." That subtle shift creates emotional movement, and movement is essential for healing. Pain becomes dangerous when it becomes frozen identity. But emotions naturally want to move when they are allowed to exist without resistance or attachment. A child cries fully, then moments later laughs again. Adults often lose this ability because the mind clings to emotional narratives long after emotions naturally wanted to pass. A painful event happens, then the mind replays it endlessly. Not because the body wants endless suffering, but because the ego fears releasing the identity attached to the suffering. This is why many people stay emotionally exhausted. The nervous system never receives permission to stop defending the old wound. The mind keeps scanning life for proof that the identity is true. If I was abandoned once, everyone will leave. If I failed once, I will fail again. If someone hurt me, nobody is safe. The original pain becomes a lens through which all future experiences are interpreted, and eventually life itself starts shrinking, not because reality became smaller, but because identity became imprisoned inside suffering. Buddhist awareness slowly breaks this prison open, not by forcing positivity, not by pretending pain never happened, but by reminding the mind, you are larger than this moment. You are larger than this emotion. You are larger than this story. That truth often takes years to fully understand, especially because suffering can feel so personal. When pain enters the heart deeply, it often feels permanent. The mind says, I will always feel this way. But human emotions are like weather patterns. Intense storms can feel endless while they are happening, yet eventually they shift. The problem is not only pain itself. The problem is the mind trying to turn temporary emotional weather into permanent identity. This is why awareness and mindfulness are so powerful in Buddhist practice. They teach people how to observe emotions without becoming emotionally possessed by them. A thought appears, a feeling appears, a memory appears. But instead of instantly merging with it, awareness quietly watches, like sitting beside a river instead of being swept away by every current. This skill changes lives, because once awareness strengthens, the person realizes they can experience pain without becoming consumed by it. They stop panicking every time sadness appears. They stop labeling themselves permanently every time fear visits. They stop believing every painful emotion defines their entire future. And slowly, the nervous system begins calming down. There is another important truth hidden here. Pain often wants witness, not resistance. Many people either suppress pain or obsess over it. But Buddhism teaches another path, the path of compassionate observation, to sit with pain honestly, to allow grief, sadness, fear, or loneliness to exist without judgment, without immediately trying to fix it, without turning it into identity, without building a permanent home inside it. That kind of presence is deeply healing, because many wounds become heavier simply because people are constantly fighting their own emotions. They say, I should not feel this way. I need to get over this immediately. What is wrong with me? That self-judgment creates secondary suffering on top of the original pain. Buddhist compassion interrupts this cycle. It says, this hurts. And I can still hold myself gently while it hurts. That gentleness matters more than people realize, especially in a world where many individuals learn to treat themselves harshly whenever they suffered. Some people speak to themselves with more cruelty than they would ever use toward another human being. And over time, that inner harshness deepens emotional wounds. But compassion softens identity, not by denying responsibility or avoiding growth, but by allowing humanity. You are human enough to hurt, human enough to struggle, human enough to feel overwhelmed sometimes, and none of those things erase your worth. Pain often convinces people they are damaged beyond repair. But Buddhism reminds us that suffering is part of human existence, not proof of personal failure. Even wise people suffer. Even peaceful people grieve. Even spiritually awakened people feel sadness. The difference is not the absence of pain. The difference is how tightly the mind clings to the pain afterward. A person trapped in identity says, this pain defines me. A person practicing awareness says, this pain is visiting me. That difference changes the entire emotional experience. And perhaps this is why so many people feel emotionally lighter after simply being deeply understood by someone, because for a moment they stop feeling fused with their suffering. They feel seen beyond the wound, seen beyond the fear, seen beyond the grief. And maybe this is what many hearts truly long for, not perfection, not constant happiness, but the reassurance that pain does not erase their humanity. Because underneath every wound, the original self still exists, still breathing, still aware, still capable of healing, still capable of peace. Buddhist teachings constantly return to this understanding. Nothing is fixed forever. Everything moves, everything changes, including pain. Even the emotions that feel unbearable eventually shift shape when they are no longer constantly fed through attachment and identity. This does not mean healing follows a perfect timeline. Some wounds take time, some grief arrives in waves, some pain softens slowly. But healing becomes possible the moment identity loosens its grip around suffering. And one day, often quietly, the person notices something surprising. The pain is still part of their story, but it is no longer the entire story. They can smile again without guilt, rest again without fear, love again without believing the past completely defines the future, not because life became perfect, but because they stopped reducing themselves to the worst thing they experienced. That is the Buddhist art of letting pain exist without becoming your identity, not denying pain, not worshipping pain, but allowing pain to move through the heart without building a permanent throne inside the soul. And maybe tonight, this is what your heart most needs to hear. You are not only your sadness, not only your grief, not only your mistakes, not only your heartbreak, not only the chapters that wounded you. There is still a deeper self underneath all of it, a self that existed before the pain arrived, a self that still exists now, quietly waiting beneath the noise of suffering. And the moment you stop defining yourself entirely by your wounds, healing no longer feels impossible. It begins feeling human. And once you begin to see that pain is not your whole identity, another door opens. Because if you are not your pain, then you do not have to keep returning to the moment that created it, as if your life is still trapped there. You do not have to keep walking back into the same memory, hoping this time the ending will change. This is where the mind becomes very clever. It tells you it is only trying to understand. It tells you it is only trying to protect you. But sometimes what you call reflection is really a quiet prison. And tonight you are going to understand why replaying the past over and over does not edit the past. It only steals life from the present. There is a special kind of tiredness that comes from living in two places at once. Your body is here, breathing in this moment, but your mind is somewhere behind you. It is sitting inside an old conversation, an old mistake, an old heartbreak, an old decision, an old version of yourself that no longer exists. You may be walking through your day, speaking to people, eating, working, smiling when you need to smile, but deep inside, a part of you is still pressing rewind. You return to the same scene again and again. What if I had spoken differently? What if I had walked away sooner? What if I had stayed quiet? What if I had noticed the signs? What if I had not trusted them? What if I had chosen another path? And the mind keeps turning these questions like a hand turning a locked door, hoping one day it will open. But the past is not a door you can reopen. It is a room you have already left, even if your thoughts keep going back to sit inside it. This is why Buddhism speaks so deeply about the present moment. Not because the past means nothing, but because the present is the only place where life can actually be touched. The past can teach you, but it cannot hold you. The past can shape you, but it does not have to own you. The past can be remembered, but it cannot be edited by suffering. And that is the painful truth many people avoid. No amount of replaying can change what happened. No amount of guilt can rewrite one sentence. No amount of regret can open a closed day and rearrange the details. No amount of overthinking can go back and make someone love you better, listen sooner, stay longer, or understand your heart the way you needed them to. Yet the mind still tries. It tries because it hates helplessness. It would rather suffer with the illusion of control than sit quietly with the truth that some things are finished. That is why replaying the past can become so addictive. It gives the mind something to do with pain. It creates the feeling that you are working on the problem, even when the problem is no longer available to be solved. A person may say, "I am just trying to understand what happened." And sometimes, yes, understanding matters. Reflection can be wise. Learning from the past can protect the future. But there is a difference between learning from a memory and living inside it. There is a difference between taking wisdom from pain and forcing pain to repeat itself every night. Reflection has an ending. Rumination has no ending. Reflection says, "What can this teach me?" Rumination says, "How can I punish myself with this again?" Reflection creates clarity. Rumination creates exhaustion. Reflection helps you return to life. Rumination keeps you trapped in a mental courtroom where you are both the judge and the accused. This is where many people lose their peace. They are not only remembering the past, they are prosecuting themselves with it. They bring up old evidence every day. They replay old scenes. They call old witnesses in their imagination. They argue with people who are no longer in the room. They defend themselves to people who may never understand. They ask questions that have no answer. And after all that mental labor, nothing changes except their own nervous system becomes more tired. Buddhist wisdom invites you to notice this pattern gently, not with shame. Because the mind does not replay the past because it is foolish. It replays the past because it is trying to find safety. It believes that if it studies the pain long enough, it can prevent future pain. It believes that if it finds the exact mistake, it can guarantee nothing like that ever happens again. But life does not give that kind of guarantee. You can learn. You can become wiser. You can become more careful. You can strengthen your boundaries. You can listen more closely to your intuition. But you cannot create a life where nothing painful ever happens again. And if your mind believes endless replaying will create perfect safety, it will never let you rest. This is why the past can become a false teacher. It teaches through fear instead of wisdom. It says, "Never trust again." It says, "Never try again." It says, "Never open your heart again." It says, "Never believe in yourself again." It takes one painful chapter and tries to turn it into the law of your entire life. But Buddhism teaches that everything changes, even pain, even fear, even the meaning of what happened to you. A memory that once felt like a life sentence can slowly become a teacher when you stop using it as a weapon against yourself. The past is not meant to be erased. It is meant to be understood, honored, and released from the role of controlling your whole inner world. There are people who are not living their lives. They are living their memories. They wake up in the morning and the first thing their mind does is return to what went wrong. They compare today to what was lost yesterday. They measure every new person against an old wound. They bring yesterday's fear into today's possibility. Then they wonder why life feels heavy. The reason is simple. You cannot carry every old version of yourself and still feel light. At some point, the hands of the heart become full of what should have happened, full of who should have stayed, full of what you should have known, full of what you should have said, full of the younger version of you who did not understand then what you understand now. And this is where compassion becomes necessary, because many people are not only replaying the past, they are attacking their past self with the knowledge they have today. They say, "How could I have been so blind? How could I have trusted that person? How could I have wasted so much time? How could I have made that decision?" But the version of you who lived through that moment did not have the wisdom you have now. They had the wounds, fears, hopes, confusion, and limited understanding they had then. They were not operating with today's clarity. They were doing what they could with the awareness they had. This does not mean every choice was good. It does not mean there are no consequences. It means healing requires fairness towards your own humanity. You cannot keep beating an old version of yourself for not knowing what only pain eventually taught you. That is not growth. That is cruelty wearing the mask of reflection. Buddhism encourages right understanding. This means seeing clearly, not seeing harshly. Clear seeing says, that happened. I see what I did not understand. I see what I need to learn. I see what I must not repeat. Harsh seeing says, I am stupid. I am ruined. I should have known everything. One brings wisdom, the other brings shame. And shame does not free you from the past. It ties you to it more tightly. When you replay the past through shame, the memory becomes heavier each time. It stops being a lesson and becomes an identity. You begin to believe you are the mistake. You are the loss. You are the failure. You are the person who was left. You are the person who was not chosen. You are the person who ruined everything. But this is not truth. This is pain speaking in a convincing voice. The Buddhist path asks you to listen more deeply than pain. Beneath the noise of regret, there is often a softer truth asking to be heard. Maybe the truth is, I needed love. Maybe the truth is, I wanted safety. Maybe the truth is, I did not know how to protect myself then. Maybe the truth is, I was afraid. Maybe the truth is, I was learning. When you see the past with compassion, the mind begins to loosen. The memory may still hurt, but it no longer needs to humiliate you. It no longer needs to drag you into endless self-attack. It can become part of your path instead of the place where your spirit remains trapped. There is another reason people replay the past. They are trying to create a different ending emotionally, even though the actual ending cannot change. The mind replays the conversation and finally says the perfect words. It imagines walking away with dignity. It imagines being understood. It imagines the other person crying, apologizing, returning, realizing what they lost. For a few seconds, the mind feels relief. Then reality returns, and the heart feels the wound again. This cycle can become painful because the mind keeps offering imaginary repairs to real wounds. But an imagined apology does not heal the body. An imagined ending does not change what happened. An imagined version of someone becoming kind does not remove the truth of how they behaved. This does not mean imagination is bad. It means the heart must eventually stop feeding on fantasies that keep it emotionally tied to what is gone. Sometimes the most healing sentence is also the hardest one. It happened the way it happened, not the way it should have, not the way you deserved, not the way your heart wanted, but the way it happened. This sentence can feel cold at first, but it is actually a doorway. Because when you finally stop trying to mentally edit the scene, you can begin caring for the person who survived it, and that person is you. Many people focus so much on changing the past that they forget to comfort the self, who is still hurting in the present. They keep asking, why did it happen? But rarely ask, what do I need now? They keep asking, how could they do that? But rarely ask, how can I protect my peace today? They keep asking, what if I had chosen differently? But rarely ask, what wise choice is available now? The mind addicted to the past asks questions that lead backward. The awakened mind begins asking questions that lead forward. This is not about rushing yourself. Buddhism is not asking you to force healing before your heart is ready. It is asking you to stop mistaking endless replaying for healing. Because sometimes what feels like processing is actually reopening. And there comes a moment when the wound does not need another replay. It needs kindness. It needs stillness. It needs permission to close. The past becomes easier to release when you understand that memory is not the same as reality. A memory is the mind's echo of something that happened. And every time you replay it, the mind may add fear, anger, regret, or longing to it. Over time, you may no longer be suffering only from what happened. You may be suffering from all the meanings your mind has attached to what happened. This is why two people can remember the same event differently. Memory is not a perfect recording. It is filtered through emotion. When you are ashamed, the past looks like proof you are not enough. When you are angry, the past looks like proof life is unfair. When you are afraid, the past looks like a warning that danger is everywhere. But when you are calm, the past may reveal a lesson that was hidden under the emotional storm. This is why stillness matters. A restless mind cannot understand the past clearly. It only keeps shaking the water and then complains that it cannot see the bottom. But when the mind becomes still, even painful memories can be seen with more wisdom. You begin to notice details you could not see before. You see your own innocence. You see your own needs. You see the other person's limitations. You see the conditions that shaped the event. You see what was yours to learn and what was never yours to carry. This is important because many people carry responsibility for things that were not fully theirs. They replay the past because they are trying to find the exact point where they could have controlled something that was never truly under their control. They think, if I had been better, they would have stayed. If I had been smarter, this would not have happened. If I had loved them differently, they would have changed. But sometimes people leave because of their own wounds. Sometimes people hurt you because of their own blindness. Sometimes opportunities fail because the conditions were not right. Sometimes life closes a door without explaining itself. Not everything that hurt you was caused by your failure. This truth can free a person from years of unnecessary self-blame. Buddhism teaches interdependence, the understanding that events arise from many causes and conditions. Nothing happens from one single cause alone. A relationship ending is not only one person. A failure is not only one mistake. A painful season is not only one decision. Life is woven from countless conditions, many visible, many invisible. When you understand this, the past becomes less personal in a painful way. You stop placing the entire universe on your own shoulders. You stop thinking everything happened because you were not enough. You begin seeing events more honestly, with wider eyes. This wider seeing is a form of freedom. It does not remove responsibility. It balances it. It allows you to own what is yours without carrying what belongs to life, timing, other people, or circumstances. That balance is very important. Some people avoid the past completely and never learn. Others obsess over the past and never live. The Buddhist way is neither avoidance nor obsession. It is mindful understanding. You look at the past with honesty. You take the lesson. You release the punishment. You return to the present, again and again. This practice may sound simple, but it is powerful, because each time you return to the present, you weaken the habit of living backward. The mind may still wander back. That is normal. Memories may still rise. Regret may still visit. But now you do not have to follow every memory into the old room. You can notice it and say, I see you. You can breathe. You can return. This is mindfulness in real life. Not sitting perfectly like a statue while nothing bothers you, but noticing when your mind has traveled into a painful yesterday and gently bringing it home. Home to the breath, home to the body, home to the room, home to this moment. Because this moment is where healing can happen. You cannot breathe yesterday's air. You cannot change yesterday's words. You cannot hold yesterday's people in the same way. But you can place a hand on your heart now. You can take one honest breath now. You can choose not to hurt yourself with the same memory now. You can begin again now. The present may feel small compared to the intensity of the past, but it holds a power the past no longer has. The present can still be shaped. That is why returning to now is not weakness, it is wisdom. Every time you stop replaying the past as if it can be edited, you reclaim a little more life. You reclaim attention, you reclaim energy, you reclaim emotional space. You reclaim the part of yourself that has been standing at the door of a closed chapter, waiting for the pages to rearrange themselves. They will not rearrange. But you can write differently from here. That is the quiet mercy of life. It does not let you edit what is gone, but it does allow you to meet what remains with more awareness. Maybe you cannot change the words you said then, but you can speak with more kindness now. Maybe you cannot undo who left, but you can stop abandoning yourself now. Maybe you cannot recover the time you lost, but you can stop giving more time to regret now. Maybe you cannot erase the pain, but you can stop turning it into a daily ritual now. This is where inner freedom becomes practical, not dramatic, not magical, practical. It is the moment you notice the mind replaying the past and gently refuse to participate in your own suffering, not with anger, not with force, but with a calm reminder. This cannot be edited anymore. And then, what needs my attention now? That question is powerful because it returns your life to your hands. The past may have shaped you, but the present asks for your participation. The present asks for your care. The present asks for your honesty. The present asks for your breath. And slowly, the mind learns a new habit. Instead of going backward every time pain appears, it begins staying close to the body. Instead of rewriting old scenes, it begins listening to current needs. Instead of arguing with memory, it begins creating peace. This does not happen in one night, but it begins in one moment of noticing, one moment of choosing not to replay, one moment of breathing instead of returning to the old wound, one moment of saying, I have learned what I can. I do not need to suffer this again today. That sentence can become medicine, because you are allowed to stop suffering the same event endlessly. You are allowed to let the lesson remain while releasing the punishment. You are allowed to remember without reliving. You are allowed to have a past without making it your home. And perhaps tonight, this is what your heart most needs to hear. The past does not need you to keep editing it. It needs you to finally understand it with compassion and walk forward with the wisdom it gave you. What happened may always be part of your story, but it does not have to keep writing every page. The old scene is over. The old words have been spoken. The old door has closed. And still, your breath is here. Your life is here. Your next gentle choice is here. So let the mind stop reaching for the impossible pen. Let it stop trying to rewrite what time has already sealed. Let it rest from the exhausting work of changing what cannot be changed, because the past cannot be edited, but your relationship with it can be healed. And slowly, after the mind becomes tired of replaying old scenes, another truth begins waiting quietly underneath the noise. A truth so simple that most people overlook its power completely. Some suffering continues not because the event is still happening, but because the mind refuses to admit that it has already happened. Tonight, you are going to understand why one honest sentence can begin loosening years of emotional struggle, and why accepting that something has already happened is not the end of your peace, but the beginning of it. There is a strange habit the human mind has when it encounters pain. Even after something ends, the mind continues reacting as if the event is still unfolding right now. A relationship ended years ago, yet the body still tightens whenever the memory appears. A betrayal happened once, yet the heart keeps preparing for it every day. A humiliation passed long ago, yet the nervous system still behaves as if danger is standing directly in front of it. This is one reason suffering can last much longer than the actual event itself. The body leaves the moment, but the mind keeps emotionally living there. Buddhism teaches that awareness brings people back into reality. And one of the most powerful forms of awareness is the quiet recognition. This has already happened. At first, that sentence sounds painfully simple, almost too simple, but hidden inside it is enormous freedom. Because many people spend years mentally fighting events that are no longer happening in the present moment. The breakup already happened. The rejection already happened. The mistake already happened. The loss already happened. The embarrassment already happened. The childhood already happened. The moment already passed through time. But the mind keeps reopening it, almost as if refusing to accept its completion. This refusal creates enormous exhaustion. It is like trying to hold shut a door that time itself has already closed. And the deeper truth is this: the mind often believes that if it fully accepts what happened, the pain will become unbearable. So instead, it stays trapped in resistance. Part of the mind keeps saying, "No, this cannot be real. This should not have happened. I cannot believe this happened to me." And because the mind never fully allows reality to settle, the nervous system never fully relaxes. This is why acceptance is not emotional passivity. It is emotional completion, not completion in the sense that pain disappears instantly, but completion in the sense that the mind finally stops interrupting reality with endless argument. A wound cannot fully heal while being reopened every day. And the mind reopens pain through denial far more often than people realize. Denial is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks very quiet. It looks like endlessly checking whether someone changed. It looks like mentally replaying how things should have gone. It looks like hoping the past will somehow rearrange itself emotionally. It looks like refusing to let the moment become fully real. But reality does not become lighter because it is resisted. If anything, resistance keeps it emotionally alive. This is why the sentence, "This has already happened," can become deeply healing. It grounds the mind in truth instead of fantasy. Not cruel truth, not hopeless truth, stable truth. Because healing cannot begin fully until reality is finally allowed to exist without interruption. There is a hidden peace that appears when the mind stops treating the past like an unfinished emergency. Think about how much energy people spend emotionally reacting to things that are already over. A person may still be defending themselves in imaginary conversations years later, still trying to prove their innocence to people who already left, still emotionally begging life for another version of the story, still mentally running toward a train that departed long ago. And because the mind refuses to fully acknowledge the ending, the heart remains trapped between worlds, not fully in the past, not fully in the present, just emotionally suspended. This suspension creates suffering. Buddhist teachings often emphasize impermanence because life is constantly moving. But the mind struggles with endings. It wants continuity, it wants reversals, it wants certainty that painful things can somehow be undone. Yet much of inner freedom begins when you stop demanding reversals from time. Time moves one way, and there is sadness in that truth, but there is also mercy. Because if painful moments pass, then suffering does not need to remain frozen forever either. Many people fear saying, "This has already happened," because they believe it means surrendering emotionally. But in reality, it means finally stepping out of emotional confusion. Confusion says, "Maybe if I think about it enough, it will feel different. Maybe if I hold on to it harder, I can change it. Maybe if I suffer enough, reality will soften." But clarity says, "It happened." And strangely, that clarity begins calming the nervous system, because clarity ends the exhausting battle between reality and resistance. A person drowning emotionally often needs truth more than fantasy. Not harsh truth delivered coldly, gentle truth, grounding truth, the kind that says, Yes, this hurt. Yes, this changed things. Yes, this matters. And yes, it already happened. That last part matters deeply because the body often behaves as if the painful moment is still actively occurring. Trauma especially works this way. The nervous system becomes trapped in survival mode, continuously scanning for danger even after the original event ended. This is why mindfulness practices in Buddhism are so powerful. They slowly teach the body and mind how to return to the present moment instead of endlessly reliving the past. Breathing becomes important because breath exists now. Awareness becomes important because awareness exists now. The body sitting in the room exists now. Not yesterday, not the old argument, not the old heartbreak, not the old shame. Now. And slowly, through awareness, the mind begins realizing something extraordinary. The memory exists, but the event itself is no longer happening. That distinction changes everything. A memory is not the same thing as present danger. A thought is not the same thing as reality. An emotional flashback is not the same thing as the current moment. This understanding creates space inside the mind, and space is where healing begins breathing again. Many people are emotionally exhausted because their minds keep treating finished pain like active pain. The relationship ended, yet the mind keeps emotionally negotiating. The opportunity disappeared, yet the mind keeps trying to mentally reopen it. The mistake happened, yet the mind keeps placing itself back on trial. This endless emotional reopening prevents closure from naturally forming, not closure given by another person. Closure created through acceptance. This is why Buddhism teaches radical presence. Because presence interrupts the endless mental reopening of what time has already carried away. The present moment quietly says, "You survived it. You are still here." The event ended, even if the memory remains. That realization can feel uncomfortable at first because the ego often wants emotional continuation. The ego builds identity through attachment to stories. But awareness gently loosens those attachments, not violently, not through force, but through repeated truth. This already happened. The more honestly this truth is accepted, the less emotional energy becomes trapped inside resistance. There is also another hidden freedom here. Once you fully accept that something already happened, you stop wasting life waiting for impossible emotional refunds. Many people secretly wait for life to return something, an apology, an explanation, a reversal, a different outcome. But sometimes life simply continues forward without offering those things. And while waiting endlessly, people accidentally place their peace on hold. They tell themselves, "I will move on once they understand me. I will heal once I get closure. I will feel peace once life explains why this happened." But what if peace begins before those things arrive? What if peace begins the moment you stop demanding the past become emotionally different before allowing yourself to live again? That is one of the deepest forms of inner freedom, not needing the past to change in order to stop suffering inside it. This does not mean pretending painful events were acceptable. Acceptance is not approval. A person can fully acknowledge that something hurt deeply while also acknowledging that the event is now part of reality. That balance matters. Because many people swing between extremes. Either they deny the pain completely or become consumed by it forever. Buddhism teaches another path. Feel the pain honestly, acknowledge reality honestly, release resistance slowly, return to the present gently, again and again. This process takes patience because the mind is often addicted to emotional unfinishedness. Unfinished pain creates emotional momentum. The mind keeps circling it because unresolved emotions demand attention. But attention alone does not heal suffering. Awareness heals suffering. and awareness notices when the mind is trying to emotionally relive something that already ended. There is a profound difference between remembering and re-entering. Remembering says, yes, that happened. Re-entering says, I am emotionally going back there again. Many people unknowingly re-enter painful memories daily. They wake up and immediately revisit old wounds mentally. They replay old conversations while brushing their teeth. They imagine alternative endings while driving. They relive betrayals before falling asleep. And because the nervous system cannot always distinguish clearly between vivid emotional memory and present danger, the body continues carrying tension. This creates chronic exhaustion, not because life is currently attacking them, but because the mind never stops reopening old doors. The phrase, "this has already happened," interrupts that cycle. It reminds the nervous system, the event is over. You are remembering, not reliving. You survived. This may sound simple, but repeated awareness slowly changes the body's relationship with memory. Not immediately, but gradually. The emotional charge softens, the compulsive replaying decreases. The body stops reacting with the same intensity every time the memory appears, and eventually something surprising happens. The memory remains, but it loses its ability to completely control your inner world. That is healing, not erasing the past, but removing its power to endlessly dominate the present. This is especially important because many people unknowingly build emotional homes around unfinished pain. They decorate their identity with old wounds. They organize their future around old fear. They stop trusting joy because pain once visited. But life cannot fully enter a heart still barricaded against reality. At some point, the emotional doors must open again, not recklessly, but honestly. And honesty begins with acknowledging what already is. This has already happened. Those words can initially feel heavy, especially when grief is involved, because part of the heart still hopes the ending is temporary. Part of the heart still waits for the phone call, the return, the reversal. But healing begins when fantasy loosens its grip and reality is finally allowed into awareness fully. That is why grief often arrives in waves. The mind slowly catches up to reality piece by piece. One day the loss feels real. The next day denial returns. Then acceptance appears briefly again. This movement is natural. Buddhism never demands perfect emotional control. It simply invites awareness into the process, to notice resistance, to notice attachment, to notice denial, and to gently return again and again to truth. Not brutal truth, compassionate truth, the kind that allows healing instead of forcing suppression. Because suppressed pain does not disappear, it waits underneath the surface. Real healing requires honesty, not endless rumination, not emotional avoidance, honest presence. There is also freedom in realizing that once something has already happened, you no longer need to keep preparing for it emotionally every second. Some people live as if old pain is constantly about to happen again. They brace themselves against intimacy because of old heartbreak, brace themselves against trust because of old betrayal, brace themselves against joy because loss once followed happiness. Their bodies remain guarded long after the original danger passed, but awareness gently asks, how long will you continue protecting yourself from a moment that already ended? That question can break something open inside the heart, because many defenses outlive the danger they were created for, and eventually those defenses begin hurting the person more than protecting them. Walls built for survival can become prisons over time. This is why acceptance matters so deeply. Acceptance tells the nervous system, you do not need to remain inside the emergency forever. That message creates softness, not weakness, softness, the kind that allows breathing again, sleeping again, trusting carefully again, living again. Because life cannot be fully experienced while emotionally trapped in old, unfinished fear. There is also tremendous humility inside the phrase, "This has already happened." Humility accepts that reality cannot always be negotiated with. Some doors close, some people change, some seasons end, some opportunities disappear, and no amount of emotional resistance can force time backward. At first, this feels painful, but eventually it becomes freeing. Because once you stop trying to reverse reality emotionally, energy becomes available for living again. The mind becomes quieter. The body relaxes more easily. The present moment feels less distant. You begin noticing small things again. Light through windows, warm tea, silence, breath, laughter, rest. The ordinary details life was always offering while the mind remained trapped elsewhere. This is why presence feels sacred in Buddhism. Presence is not only spiritual awareness, it is emotional return. Return from memory, return from resistance, return from endless mental negotiation with reality, back into life itself. And maybe this is what many people truly long for when they say they want peace. Not a perfect life, not erased pain, but freedom from endlessly reliving what is already over. Freedom from mentally dragging yesterday into every moment. Freedom from the exhausting hope that the past might somehow become emotionally different if revisited enough times. That freedom begins quietly, with awareness, with honesty, with breath, with one simple sentence repeated gently until the nervous system finally believes it. This has already happened, not to create hopelessness, but to create release. Because once reality is finally allowed to settle fully inside awareness, the war against it begins ending. And in the silence left behind, peace slowly begins entering where resistance used to live. And as the mind slowly learns to stop reopening what has already happened, another painful truth begins to rise to the surface. Some suffering does not come from the event itself, but from the inability to. Accept that certain doors will never open again, no matter how sincere your love was, how good your intentions were, or how deeply you hoped things would turn out differently. Tonight, you are going to understand one of the hardest lessons in the path to inner freedom. Sometimes life closes a door, not because your heart was impure, but because not every door is meant to remain open forever. One of the most painful experiences in human life is realizing that goodness does not always guarantee the outcome you hoped for. You can love someone deeply, and they still leave. You can remain loyal, and still be betrayed. You can work hard, and still not succeed the way you imagined. You can pray, hope, forgive, sacrifice, and try again, yet some doors remain closed anyway. This truth breaks many hearts because human beings naturally want life to feel fair. The mind quietly believes that sincerity should always be rewarded. It believes pure intentions should automatically create happy endings. But life does not always move according to emotional fairness. And this is where many people begin secretly fighting reality again. Not because they are weak, but because part of them cannot understand why something beautiful still disappeared, why something they cared for still ended, why something they truly wanted never arrived. This confusion can become very heavy, especially for gentle people, especially for people who gave their hearts honestly. Because when someone with a pure heart experiences rejection or loss, they often ask themselves dangerous questions. What is wrong with me? Why was I not enough? Why did life close this door after all I gave? And slowly, pain begins turning inward. Instead of seeing that life contains uncertainty, timing, other people's choices, and conditions beyond control, the person assumes the closed door must be proof of personal failure. But Buddhism teaches something different. Not all closed doors are punishments. Not all endings are proof of worthlessness. And not every loss means you failed. Sometimes life closes a door simply because that chapter has reached its end, even if your heart still wanted more pages. This is difficult to accept because the human mind wants clean explanations. It wants every painful ending to make perfect emotional sense. But reality often moves in more mysterious ways than the ego can understand. Some people enter your life only for a season. Some opportunities exist only to redirect you. Some dreams collapse because the version of you chasing them needed to change first. And some doors remain closed because opening them would eventually create deeper suffering you cannot yet see. At first, these ideas can sound frustrating. The hurting heart says, "But I loved them. But I tried. But I cared." And those feelings are real. They deserve compassion. But Buddhism gently reminds us that attachment often creates the illusion that effort guarantees permanence. It does not. You can water a garden lovingly and still experience winter. You can protect something carefully and still watch it change. You can offer your whole heart to someone and still discover they cannot meet you in the same depth. This does not erase the beauty of what you gave. And this is important to understand. A closed door does not automatically mean your love was foolish. Many people become ashamed after rejection or loss. They look back at their own sincerity and feel embarrassed by how deeply they cared. But there is nothing shameful about having a heart capable of genuine love. The shame belongs to cruelty, not tenderness. The shame belongs to dishonesty, not vulnerability. Yet pain often tricks people into hardening themselves afterward. Someone hurts them, and they decide never to trust again. Life disappoints them, and they decide never to hope again. A door closes, and they decide to close themselves completely too. But Buddhism teaches that suffering should deepen wisdom, not destroy openness. There is a difference between becoming wise and becoming emotionally frozen. A wise person learns discernment. A wounded person sometimes learns fear, and fear often disguises itself as strength. It says, "I do not care anymore. I do not need anyone. I will never feel deeply again." But underneath those statements is usually a heart terrified of experiencing another closed door. This fear is understandable. Human beings naturally avoid pain, but a completely closed heart eventually suffers too, because life cannot fully enter a person who has barricaded themselves against disappointment. This is why Buddhist teachings emphasize balance so often. Not blind attachment, not total emotional withdrawal, but compassionate awareness. To love while understanding impermanence, to care while understanding uncertainty, to remain open without demanding guarantees from life. That is difficult, very difficult, because the ego constantly wants certainty before vulnerability. It says, "Promise me this will not hurt. Promise me they will stay. Promise me this effort will succeed. Promise me I will not lose again." But life cannot offer those promises, and perhaps part of maturity is learning how to keep living honestly without demanding impossible guarantees from existence. This does not mean becoming passive. It means accepting reality's uncertainty without allowing uncertainty to destroy your ability to love, trust, or move forward. There is also another painful truth hidden inside closed doors. Sometimes people remain emotionally attached to a closed door because reopening it feels easier than facing the unknown beyond it. The familiar pain becomes safer than uncertain possibility. A person may keep chasing someone unavailable because at least the emotional story feels known. They may stay emotionally attached to an old dream because releasing it would require creating a new direction. They may continue begging internally for old circumstances to return because moving forward feels frightening. This is why some closed doors become emotional obsessions. The mind keeps knocking, keeps hoping, keeps replaying, keeps bargaining, not only because of love or desire, but because uncertainty feels terrifying. But Buddhism teaches something profound about attachment. Clinging creates suffering because reality itself constantly changes. Nothing remains frozen forever. People change, feelings change, dreams change, circumstances change. And when the mind desperately tries to force permanence onto temporary things, suffering intensifies. This does not mean relationships or goals are meaningless. It means peace cannot depend entirely on controlling outcomes. That is where hidden freedom begins appearing, not when every door opens, but when your inner stability no longer collapses every time one closes. This is one of the deepest forms of emotional maturity. To realize your worth is not determined by access. Not everyone who rejects you is rejecting your value. Not every missed opportunity is proof of failure. Not every closed door means you are unworthy of love, success, connection, or peace. Sometimes doors close because life is moving differently than your current understanding can see. This is especially painful when the heart feels pure, when you genuinely tried, when your intentions were honest, because part of the mind expects goodness to protect against pain. But Buddhism never promises a painless life to good people. Instead, it teaches how to remain awake and compassionate even when life disappoints you. This is far more powerful than false guarantees, because eventually everyone experiences closed doors. The question is not whether disappointment will happen. The question is whether disappointment will harden the heart permanently. Some people experience one painful ending and spend the rest of their lives emotionally locked behind it. Others experience deep heartbreak, yet slowly become softer, wiser, calmer, and more compassionate afterward. The event alone does not determine the outcome. The relationship with the event does. This is why awareness matters so deeply. Awareness notices when attachment becomes self-destruction. It notices when longing becomes obsession. It notices when hope becomes refusal to accept reality. And gently, patiently, awareness begins loosening the grip, not by forcing forgetting, not by denying grief, but by reminding the heart, you cannot force a closed door open forever. This truth hurts at first because many people secretly believe persistence alone can conquer all outcomes. And yes, persistence matters in life, but there is a difference between perseverance and emotional imprisonment. Perseverance moves forward wisely. Imprisonment keeps begging reality to become different. One creates growth, the other creates exhaustion. A bird trapped against a closed window eventually injures itself, not because freedom is impossible, but because it keeps flying toward the wrong opening. Human beings often do the same emotionally. They keep trying to enter spaces that no longer welcome them, keep chasing people who continuously withdraw, keep returning to old identities life already outgrew, keep knocking on doors that time itself already closed. And slowly the repeated rejection begins damaging self-worth. Not because they lack value, but because attachment keeps placing them where acceptance no longer exists. This is why inner freedom sometimes begins with turning away from the closed door instead of endlessly staring at it. Not bitterly, not angrily, but honestly, because some suffering continues only because the heart refuses to stop waiting outside places that no longer hold life for it. There is grief in walking away from a closed door, real grief, because letting go often means accepting that certain dreams, versions of people, or imagined futures will never fully exist. That acceptance can feel like mourning an invisible death. You are not only grieving what happened, you are grieving what could have been, the future you pictured, the conversations you hoped for, the love you imagined, the life you expected. And invisible grief is still grief. Buddhism understands this deeply. Much suffering comes not only from reality itself, but from attachment to imagined realities that never fully arrived. The mind mourns possibilities as intensely as actual events. This is why letting go can feel so painful. You are not only releasing a person or opportunity, you are releasing a version of life your heart became emotionally attached to. And yet, hidden inside this grief is also freedom. Because once you stop standing outside the closed door, life begins moving again. Energy slowly returns, attention returns, curiosity returns. The present moment becomes visible again. Many people do not realize how much life they lose while emotionally waiting for impossible reopenings. Years pass, opportunities pass, connections pass, peace passes, because the heart remains emotionally stationed at an ending. But life continues flowing beyond closed doors. This is important, very important, because the mind often behaves as though one closed door means all future joy is impossible. But reality rarely works that way. Life continuously changes shape. New people appear, new understandings emerge, new paths reveal themselves slowly, not always immediately, not always comfortably, but often in ways the attached mind could not previously imagine. This does not mean every loss secretly hides a perfect replacement. Buddhism is not teaching toxic positivity. Some losses remain painful. Some endings genuinely matter forever. But suffering deepens unnecessarily when the mind insists one closed door destroyed all future possibility. That belief creates hopelessness. Awareness creates openness again. Not naive openness, grounded openness. The understanding that life still exists beyond disappointment. There is another hidden lesson inside closed doors. Sometimes the closed door is protecting your deeper self from remaining trapped in a smaller version of life. A relationship that ended may have been preventing growth. A failed dream may redirect you toward deeper meaning. A rejection may quietly free you from spaces that never truly saw your worth. But attached minds rarely see this immediately because attachment focuses only on immediate loss. Wisdom sees movement. This is why time changes understanding. Things that once felt catastrophic sometimes later reveal hidden guidance, not because the pain was fake, but because human understanding evolves. Buddhism teaches impermanence not to create fear, but to create flexibility. The person who accepts change suffers less than the person demanding permanence from everything. And perhaps one of the hardest forms of acceptance is accepting that goodness alone cannot force outcomes. You can be kind and still lose. You can be sincere and still experience rejection. You can be loving and still encounter people incapable of meeting your depth. This does not mean kindness is weakness. It means life is not a transaction where pure intentions automatically purchase desired endings. At first, this truth feels unfair, but eventually it becomes liberating. Because once you stop measuring your worth entirely by outcomes, you become freer emotionally. A closed door stops being proof of inadequacy. It simply becomes part of reality's movement, part of life's unfolding, part of the impermanence all human beings eventually face. And maybe this is where deeper peace begins appearing. Not in forcing every door open, not in making life obey your hopes perfectly, but in trusting that your soul can survive disappointment without collapsing into bitterness. This trust changes everything, because bitterness is often just wounded hope that never learned acceptance. A bitter person keeps emotionally arguing with reality long after the ending occurred. But a peaceful person slowly learns how to bow gently before what cannot be forced. Not because they stopped caring, but because they stopped destroying themselves trying to control the uncontrollable. That is true strength. the strength to love deeply without demanding guarantees, the strength to grieve honestly without worshipping loss forever, the strength to release what no longer opens without losing your ability to remain soft. This softness is rare. Many people become emotionally hard after pain, but Buddhism teaches another possibility: to become wiser without becoming colder, to become discerning without becoming closed, to remain compassionate even after disappointment. And perhaps this is the hidden freedom inside closed doors, the realization that your peace does not depend on every path remaining available forever. Some things will leave, some things will end, some dreams will not unfold the way you hoped. And still, your spirit can remain whole. Still, your heart can remain open. Still, life can continue offering beauty in forms you do not yet understand, because closed doors are not always the end of life. Sometimes they are the painful beginning of finally meeting yourself more honestly, the version of you no longer defined entirely by chasing unavailable things, the version of you no longer begging reality to reverse itself. The version of you capable of standing before a closed door and quietly saying, "I loved honestly. I tried sincerely. And now I release what will not open." That sentence contains enormous dignity, because there comes a moment when peace matters more than endlessly forcing entry into spaces no longer meant for you. And maybe tonight, this is what your heart most needs to hear. Some doors stay closed, not because your heart lacked purity, but because life itself moves through seasons, endings, redirections, and impermanence. You are not unworthy because something ended. You are not broken because something did not choose you. You are not cursed because life changed shape. Sometimes a closed door is simply reality, asking you to stop standing outside what no longer belongs to your path. And the moment you stop begging closed doors to reopen, you finally notice the quiet space around you, where life is still waiting to be lived. And as the heart slowly learns to stop standing outside closed doors, another hidden grief often begins rising from deeper places inside the soul. Because sometimes the hardest door to accept was never a relationship, a dream, or an opportunity. Sometimes the hardest thing to accept is the childhood you never truly had. Tonight, you are going to understand why so much adult suffering quietly begins in unfinished pain from long ago, and why inner peace sometimes starts the moment you stop demanding a different past from people who were never able to give it. There are wounds that do not bleed openly, yet they shape an entire life. A child who never felt safe may grow into an adult who struggles to relax. A child who was constantly criticized may become an adult who secretly believes they are never enough. A child who felt emotionally invisible may spend years begging for love in unhealthy places. A child who learned that love was unpredictable may grow up terrified of abandonment. And often, these wounds remain hidden beneath adult responsibilities, routines, relationships, careers, and distractions. But deep inside, the younger self still waits quietly for something that never fully arrived. Understanding, protection, warmth, gentleness, safety, the feeling of truly being seen. This is why childhood pain can become so difficult to release. Because unlike many adult disappointments, childhood shapes the foundation of how a person learns to see themselves and the world. When pain enters early, the nervous system adapts around survival. Some children become people pleasers because keeping others happy felt safer than expressing their truth. Some become emotionally distant because vulnerability once led to pain. Some become hyper-independent because they learned too early that nobody would rescue them emotionally. Some become anxious because their environment constantly felt unpredictable. And then adulthood arrives, but the body still carries the emotional memory of those early experiences. This is why some reactions feel much bigger than the present moment. A small rejection suddenly feels unbearable. A disagreement feels like abandonment. Silence feels dangerous. Criticism feels crushing. Not because the adult self is weak, but because the younger self inside still remembers what it once meant to feel unsafe. Buddhism teaches that suffering often continues when the mind clings to what reality did not provide. And one of the deepest forms of clinging is the lifelong demand for a different childhood. Many adults are still emotionally waiting for parents to become who they needed, still waiting for apologies that may never come, still waiting for understanding, still waiting for someone to finally say, "You deserved better. You were lovable. You were not the problem. You should have been protected." And when these words never fully arrive, pain hardens quietly over time. The heart begins carrying invisible grief. Not only grief for what happened, but grief for what never happened. The childhood that never felt peaceful, the comfort that never existed, the emotional safety that never arrived, the innocence that disappeared too early. This kind of grief is difficult because it is often invisible to others. A person may appear successful, calm, functional, even strong, but inside there may still be a younger self carrying loneliness from decades ago. This is why healing childhood wounds is not about blaming endlessly. It is about understanding honestly. Many people either deny their childhood pain completely or become trapped inside resentment forever. Buddhism teaches another path, the path of awareness without permanent bitterness, the path of seeing clearly without remaining emotionally imprisoned there. This is important because unresolved childhood pain often controls adult life unconsciously. A person may continuously chase unavailable partners because emotionally they are still trying to earn love they never fully received. Another may become addicted to achievement because praise became their only source of worth as a child. Another may avoid closeness because intimacy feels emotionally dangerous. Another may constantly apologize for existing because they grew up feeling like a burden. And often these patterns continue for years until awareness finally interrupts them. Awareness begins noticing, "I am reacting from an old wound. This fear is older than this moment. My nervous system learned this long ago." That realization can feel painful, but it is also freeing, because once unconscious patterns become visible, healing becomes possible. Before awareness, the wound controls life silently. After awareness, the person can begin responding differently, but this process requires enormous compassion, especially toward the younger self. Many adults secretly judge the child they once were. They say things like, "I should be over this. Other people had it worse. I am too sensitive. I need to stop feeling this way." But pain does not heal through humiliation. A frightened child does not become calm through criticism. And the younger self inside many adults is still frightened, still carrying emotional confusion, still carrying unmet needs, still wondering why love felt difficult to receive. This is why Buddhist compassion matters so deeply in healing. Compassion softens the war against yourself, not by denying what happened, but by refusing to continue punishing yourself for surviving it imperfectly. There is another difficult truth many people eventually face. Sometimes parents simply could not give what they themselves never received. This does not erase harm, it does not excuse cruelty, but it creates understanding. Many wounded adults were once wounded children raising children. Many emotionally unavailable parents were never taught emotional safety themselves. Many harsh people were shaped by harshness long before you existed. Pain travels through generations quietly until awareness interrupts it. This understanding matters because hatred alone rarely heals childhood wounds. Hatred keeps the nervous system emotionally tied to the original pain. The mind remains trapped in the hope that rage will somehow create a different past. But no amount of anger can reopen childhood and rearrange the emotional conditions. This is where acceptance becomes one of the hardest spiritual practices of all. Accepting that your childhood happened the way it happened. Accepting that some needs were not met. Accepting that some people may never fully understand the pain they caused. Accepting that your younger self deserved better while also understanding reality cannot now become different retroactively. This acceptance does not mean pretending the pain was okay. It means releasing the endless internal demand for the past to become something it never was. That demand quietly exhausts many people for decades, because part of the mind keeps saying, if they would finally apologize, I could heal. If they would finally understand me, I could feel peace. If my childhood had been different, I would be whole. But Buddhism gently points toward another truth. Wholeness does not begin when the past changes. Wholeness begins when awareness stops demanding the impossible from time. This realization often creates grief first, real grief. Because releasing the need for a different childhood means mourning what never existed fully. Mourning the nurturing you deserved, the softness you deserved, the emotional safety you deserved, the guidance you deserved, the consistency you deserved. This grief matters, because many people try skipping directly to forgiveness while never allowing themselves to honestly grieve. But ungrieved pain remains alive inside the body. Healing requires honesty, not dramatic storytelling, not endless blame, honest acknowledgement. Yes, this hurt. Yes, this shaped me. Yes, I deserved care. That honesty is not weakness, it is emotional truth, and truth creates the foundation for peace. There is also hidden freedom in realizing that your childhood explains you, but it does not have to imprison you forever. This distinction is extremely important. Some people deny their wounds entirely. Others become completely identified with them. Buddhism teaches another way. Awareness without permanent identity. You can understand why you developed certain fears without deciding you are doomed forever. You can recognize the pain without building your entire future around it. You can honor the younger self without remaining emotionally frozen in childhood forever. This balance creates healing, not instant healing, but real healing. Because once awareness grows, choices slowly become possible. A person who grew up around emotional chaos can slowly learn calmness. A person who learned fear can slowly learn safety. A person who never felt heard can slowly learn self-expression. A person who felt unloved can slowly learn self-compassion. This process takes patience because nervous systems shaped by childhood pain often expect danger automatically. The body may brace itself even during peaceful moments. Some people feel uncomfortable when life becomes calm because chaos feels more familiar than peace. Others sabotage healthy relationships because stable love feels emotionally unfamiliar. The nervous system repeats what it learned early, even when those patterns create suffering. This is why awareness must be paired with gentleness. You cannot force a frightened inner self into peace through harshness. You cannot shame your nervous system into healing. Healing often happens through repeated experiences of safety, repeated moments of self-kindness, repeated reminders that the danger is no longer here, repeated awareness that the adult self can now offer protection the child self never received. This is one reason mindfulness matters so deeply. Mindfulness teaches the body to return to the present moment instead of remaining trapped in old emotional environments. The child inside may still fear rejection, but the adult self can breathe now. The child inside may still expect criticism, but awareness can respond gently now. The child inside may still feel abandoned, but presence can offer companionship now. This changes the relationship with pain completely. Instead of constantly searching backward for missing love, the person slowly learns how to offer love inwardly, not narcissistic self-obsession, steady self-compassion, the kind that says, "I see your pain. I understand why you became this way. You are allowed to heal." That inner softness matters more than many people realize, especially because many wounded adults continue internally repeating the same harshness they once received externally. A critical parent disappears physically, yet the inner critic remains alive for decades. The voice changes location but continues speaking. You are not enough. You are too emotional. You always fail. You do not deserve rest. You must earn love. Buddhist awareness notices these inner voices without automatically believing them. This is powerful, because many people mistake inherited emotional conditioning for objective truth. But thoughts shaped by pain are not always accurate reflections of reality. They are survival patterns, and survival patterns can change, slowly, patiently, with awareness, with compassion, with repetition. This is why releasing the need for a different childhood is not the same as forgetting the past. It means stopping the endless emotional negotiation with what already happened. It means recognizing, yes, I wish it had been different. And yes, I can still build peace from here. That second sentence is life-changing, because many people unconsciously postpone healing until the past becomes emotionally corrected somehow. But time does not move backward. Parents may never transform into emotionally safe people. Some conversations may never happen. Some apologies may never arrive. Some emotional gaps may remain. And still, healing remains possible. Not because the pain disappears, but because the adult self stops abandoning themselves waiting for the past to change. This is where responsibility quietly enters the healing process. Not blame, responsibility. The understanding that while you did not choose your childhood, you now participate in how your wounds are carried forward. This realization can feel overwhelming at first, especially because wounded people often feel exhausted already. But hidden inside responsibility is also power, because once awareness enters, new choices become possible. Cycles can end, patterns can soften, inner violence can stop repeating. A person raised around emotional neglect can become emotionally present. A person raised around anger can become gentle. A person raised around fear can create safety. This is one of the most beautiful possibilities in human life. Pain does not have to become destiny. Awareness interrupts inheritance. And perhaps one of the deepest forms of healing is becoming the kind of presence you once needed yourself. Not perfectly, not all at once, but intentionally, through small moments. Resting when exhausted instead of punishing yourself. Speaking kindly inwardly instead of repeating old criticism, allowing emotions instead of suppressing them, creating boundaries instead of accepting mistreatment automatically, listening to your needs instead of abandoning them. These small acts slowly rebuild inner trust. And inner trust is essential because many wounded children grew into adults who no longer fully trust themselves emotionally. They learned to prioritize survival over authenticity, pleasing over honesty, performing over resting. But healing reconnects people to their inner world again, not the frightened child alone, but the deeper awareness beneath the fear, the calm witness beneath the conditioning, the self capable of compassion, the self capable of peace. Buddhism often teaches that freedom begins not when life becomes perfect, but when attachment softens. And perhaps one of the deepest attachments many people carry is attachment to the fantasy of the childhood they wish they had received. This fantasy is understandable, Every child deserves love. Every child deserves safety. Every child deserves emotional care. But clinging endlessly to the impossible wish for a rewritten past often prevents the heart from fully living now. At some point, the grieving heart must slowly release the demand for history to become different, not because it did not matter, but because your life still exists beyond it. There are still breaths to take, moments to experience, connections to build, peace to discover. The wounded child deserves acknowledgement, but your entire future does not deserve imprisonment inside old pain forever. This realization creates profound emotional freedom, not dramatic freedom, quiet freedom, the freedom of no longer needing your past to change before allowing yourself tenderness, the freedom of no longer defining your worth entirely by what you lacked early in life. The freedom of understanding that while childhood shaped you deeply, it does not contain the entirety of who you can become. And maybe tonight, this is what your heart most needs to hear. You did not deserve the moments that made you feel unseen, unsafe, or emotionally alone. Your pain was real, your needs were real, your younger self deserved gentleness. But your peace cannot remain trapped waiting for the past to become different. At some point, healing begins with softly releasing the impossible wish for another childhood and gently learning how to care for the life still unfolding in front of you now. Because the child inside you does not only need mourning anymore, they also need the adult version of you to finally stop abandoning them to the past. And as the heart slowly stops begging the past to become different, another difficult lesson quietly begins appearing. Because healing is not only about accepting your own pain, it is also about learning how to see other people clearly without allowing their behavior to poison your inner peace forever. Tonight, you are going to understand one of the most misunderstood forms of acceptance, the kind that allows you to stop carrying hatred inside your body without pretending harmful actions were acceptable. One of the hardest things for the human heart to understand is this: accepting someone does not mean agreeing with them. Many people struggle deeply with this because they confuse acceptance with approval. They believe that if they stop hating someone, it means the pain did not matter. They believe that if they release anger, it means the other person wins. They believe acceptance requires pretending harmful behavior was somehow okay. But Buddhism teaches something much wiser and much more freeing. You can accept reality without approving of it. You can understand someone without excusing them. You can release hatred without inviting harm back into your life. And perhaps most importantly, you can stop carrying someone else's darkness inside your own nervous system. This lesson becomes necessary because human beings hurt each other constantly. People lie, people betray trust, people manipulate, people abandon. People say cruel things, people fail to love carefully, and when this happens, the mind often splits into extremes. One extreme says, pretend it did not hurt. The other says, remain angry forever. But neither creates peace. Suppressing pain only buries it deeper inside the body. Endless hatred chains your emotional life to the person who wounded you. Buddhism teaches another path: clear seeing without emotional imprisonment. This means seeing people honestly, without fantasy, and without endless bitterness. Because one reason suffering lasts so long is that many people refuse to accept who someone truly is. Instead, they remain emotionally attached to who they hoped that person would become. This happens constantly in relationships. A person lies repeatedly, but the heart keeps clinging to isolated moments of tenderness. A person keeps disrespecting boundaries, but the mind says, maybe they will change. A parent remains emotionally unavailable for decades, but the child inside still waits for warmth. A friend betrays trust again and again, but attachment keeps hoping for a different outcome. The suffering deepens because reality and hope keep fighting each other. Reality says, This person continues behaving this way. Attachment says, "But I need them to become different." And the mind becomes exhausted trying to force emotional transformation onto someone who may not truly want to change. This is why acceptance becomes powerful. Acceptance does not say, "Their behavior was okay." Acceptance says, "I finally see clearly who they are." That clarity creates freedom. Because once you stop demanding people become different before allowing yourself peace, you stop emotionally depending on impossible outcomes. This does not mean giving up discernment. In fact, Buddhism encourages wise discernment deeply. A peaceful person is not someone who blindly tolerates harm. A peaceful person sees clearly without becoming consumed by hatred. That balance matters enormously, because many wounded people become trapped in cycles of emotional attachment disguised as moral outrage. They replay the betrayal constantly, replay the disrespect, replay the cruelty, replay what should have happened differently. And without realizing it, the person who hurt them continues occupying enormous space inside their inner world. This is one reason hatred becomes so exhausting. Hatred keeps the nervous system emotionally connected to the source of pain. The body remains tense. The mind remains restless. The heart remains trapped in unfinished emotional conflict. Buddhist teachings understand this deeply. Anger itself is not evil. Anger often appears naturally when boundaries are violated, but attachment to anger becomes suffering, because eventually the fire meant to protect begins burning the person carrying it. There is an old Buddhist understanding that holding hatred is like gripping a burning coal, hoping to throw it at someone else later. Meanwhile, your own hand continues burning first. This does not mean becoming passive. It means understanding that inner peace matters too much to sacrifice endlessly at the altar of resentment. Many people secretly believe resentment protects them. If I stay angry, I will never be hurt again. If I hate them enough, I stay strong. If I keep replaying what they did, I remain safe. But often resentment does not create safety. It creates emotional imprisonment. The mind keeps circling the same pain endlessly, and life begins shrinking around the wound. This is especially dangerous because resentment often disguises itself as justice. The mind says, "I deserve to stay angry after what happened." And yes, the pain may be real, the betrayal may be real, the harm may be real, but endless emotional attachment to the injury still creates suffering inside you. Buddhism invites a different question. How long do you want another person's actions to continue controlling your nervous system? That question changes things. Because many people continue reliving emotional injuries long after the actual event ended. The other person may have moved on entirely while the wounded mind keeps reopening the scene daily. This does not create healing. It creates continued captivity. Acceptance interrupts this cycle, not by pretending harm never occurred, but by fully acknowledging reality instead of emotionally wrestling it forever. This person behaved this way. This person could not give what I needed. This person caused pain. This person may never become who I hoped. Those truths may hurt deeply, but clarity hurts less than endless emotional illusion. This is especially important because many people confuse compassion with self-abandonment. They think being spiritually peaceful means allowing unlimited mistreatment. But Buddhism never teaches people to destroy themselves for the comfort of others. Compassion and boundaries can exist together. You can understand someone's wounds without allowing them to wound you repeatedly. You can recognize someone's suffering without giving them unlimited access to your peace. You can forgive internally while still walking away externally. This distinction saves many lives emotionally. Because wounded people often stay trapped inside harmful dynamics, believing love requires endless tolerance. But acceptance is not submission. Acceptance is seeing reality clearly enough to stop lying to yourself. If someone continuously harms you, acceptance means recognizing the pattern honestly, not fantasizing about their potential while ignoring their actions repeatedly. Potential is not behavior. Promises are not transformation. Words are not character. Reality is revealed through repeated action. And Buddhism encourages awareness of reality over attachment to fantasy. Many people suffer because they fall in love with imagined versions of people instead of seeing who is actually standing in front of them. They love possibility more than reality. They love hope more than truth. And while hope can be beautiful, hope disconnected from reality creates deep suffering. At some point, peace requires seeing clearly, not cruelly, clearly. This clarity often creates grief first, because when illusions disappear, reality finally becomes fully visible. A person realizes they may never love me the way I need. They may never apologize. They may never understand the pain they caused. They may never change. This realization can break the heart open, but strangely, it can also begin setting the heart free, because now emotional energy no longer needs to remain trapped in endless waiting for transformation, waiting for awareness, waiting for justice, waiting for impossible emotional repayment. The mind can finally rest from trying to control another person's evolution. That rest matters deeply, especially because human beings cannot force consciousness onto others. You cannot force empathy, you cannot force accountability, you cannot force emotional maturity, you cannot force self-awareness. And exhausting yourself trying to create these things inside another person often destroys peace inside yourself first. This is why Buddhism emphasizes letting go of attachment to outcomes, not because outcomes do not matter, but because emotional survival cannot depend entirely on controlling people beyond your control. There is also another important truth hidden here. People's harmful actions often arise from their own suffering, conditioning, fear, ego, or unconsciousness. Again, this does not excuse harm, but understanding this changes the emotional relationship with hatred. A deeply wounded person often wounds others. An unconscious person often spreads unconsciousness. Someone disconnected from themselves often creates disconnection around them. Seeing this creates compassion without naivete. Compassion says, I understand suffering shapes behavior. Wisdom says, and I still need healthy boundaries. Both truths can exist together. This balance is extremely important because many people swing between emotional extremes, either complete hatred or complete self-sacrifice. Buddhism teaches the middle path, clear awareness, compassion, boundaries, non-attachment, inner peace, all existing together. This does not happen overnight, especially when pain is deep. Some wounds require time before anger softens naturally. And Buddhism does not ask you to force fake forgiveness while your nervous system is still overwhelmed. Forced forgiveness often becomes another form of emotional suppression. Real healing happens more honestly. First awareness, then honesty, then grief, then clarity, then gradual release. The release comes not because the pain was small, but because carrying endless emotional poison eventually becomes too heavy. And perhaps one of the deepest forms of freedom is realizing you no longer need another person to become good before allowing yourself peace. This realization changes relationships completely. You stop emotionally chasing unavailable people. Stop trying to rescue destructive people endlessly. Stop sacrificing your nervous system trying to earn basic decency. Stop bargaining with reality. Instead, awareness quietly says, this is who they are right now. That sentence is powerful because many people keep loving people based on memory, fantasy, or potential instead of present reality. But reality is where peace exists. Not fantasy, not future projection, reality. And reality often reveals uncomfortable truths. Some people are not emotionally safe. Some people are deeply unconscious. Some people repeatedly choose selfishness. Some people cannot meet your depth. Some people remain committed to behaviors that create suffering. Accepting this does not make you bitter. It makes you awake. Awake enough to stop abandoning yourself emotionally. Awake enough to stop waiting for unavailable people to become emotionally available through your suffering alone. Awake enough to stop confusing emotional attachment with love. Because love without awareness often becomes self-destruction. True compassion includes yourself too. This is another lesson many people miss. They offer endless understanding to others while offering none to themselves. They excuse harmful behavior repeatedly while ignoring their own exhaustion. They prioritize another person's wounds while neglecting their own healing. Eventually, resentment grows because self-betrayal always creates inner pain. Buddhist compassion begins inwardly first, not selfishly, but honestly. You matter too. Your peace matters too. Your nervous system matters too. Your boundaries matter too. This understanding changes the way you relate to difficult people. You stop needing to hate them to protect yourself. Hatred becomes unnecessary once clarity exists. You simply see reality honestly and respond wisely. Sometimes wisely means distance. Sometimes wisely means compassion without closeness. Sometimes wisely means ending access. Sometimes wisely means grieving what never truly existed. And sometimes wisely means accepting that another person's journey belongs to them, not you. This acceptance creates tremendous emotional freedom because many people unconsciously carry responsibility for changing others. They believe, if I love them enough, they will heal. If I stay patient enough, they will awaken. If I explain myself perfectly, they will understand. But human beings only truly change when they themselves become willing to see clearly. No amount of suffering on your part can force awareness into another person. This truth can feel heartbreaking, but it can also feel liberating. Because once you stop trying to emotionally manage another person's consciousness, your energy returns to your own life again, your own healing, your own peace, your own awareness. This is where acceptance becomes deeply practical. You stop wasting life fighting reality emotionally. You stop trying to rewrite people internally. You stop demanding impossible emotional outcomes. And slowly, your nervous system relaxes. Not because everyone becomes good, but because your peace no longer depends entirely on controlling human behavior around you. This is real inner freedom, not the fantasy of a world where nobody hurts you, but the wisdom of remaining grounded even when people disappoint you. And perhaps this is one of the most mature forms of love possible, to see people clearly, to understand their humanity, to recognize their wounds, to acknowledge their harmful actions honestly, and still refuse to let hatred completely consume your own heart, not because they deserve endless access to you, but because your peace deserves protection too. This is why Buddhism speaks so deeply about non-attachment. Non-attachment does not mean you stop caring. It means your soul stops becoming chained to what it cannot control. You stop gripping people emotionally so tightly that their behavior determines your entire inner state. You begin standing inside your own awareness more steadily. And from that place, compassion becomes possible without self-destruction. This balance creates enormous peace, because eventually you realize something life-changing. You do not need to carry bitterness forever in order to honor your pain. You do not need endless hatred to prove something mattered. You do not need revenge fantasies to protect your dignity. Sometimes the deepest dignity is quietly releasing emotional warfare entirely, not because the pain was insignificant, but because your inner life is too valuable to permanently hand over to resentment. And maybe tonight, this is what your heart most needs to hear. You are allowed to accept people as they truly are without approving of what they did. You are allowed to recognize harmful behavior without becoming consumed by hatred. You are allowed to walk away peacefully from what continuously wounds you. You are allowed to stop waiting for impossible transformation before allowing yourself rest. Because acceptance is not saying what happened was okay. Acceptance is saying, I finally see reality clearly enough to stop destroying myself fighting it. And hidden inside that clarity is the beginning of a much deeper peace. And as the heart slowly learns to stop fighting people for becoming who they truly are, another painful attachment begins revealing itself underneath the surface, because sometimes suffering does not continue only because of what happened. It continues because a part of you is still waiting for life itself to finally admit that it hurt you unfairly. Tonight, you are going to understand why many people remain emotionally trapped for years, waiting for apologies, explanations, justice, or emotional repayment that may never fully arrive. And why inner freedom often begins the moment you stop postponing your peace until life apologizes first. There is a hidden sentence living inside many wounded hearts, even if it is never spoken out loud. I cannot move on until this is made right. At first, this sounds understandable. Human beings naturally want resolution. When pain enters life unfairly, the heart wants acknowledgement. It wants someone to finally recognize the damage. It wants justice. It wants understanding. It wants the universe itself to say, yes, what happened to you was wrong. And sometimes that acknowledgement does come. Sometimes people apologize sincerely. Sometimes truth becomes visible. Sometimes wounds are recognized openly, but many times life stays silent. The person who hurt you may never fully understand the impact of their actions. The family that misunderstood you may never suddenly awaken emotionally. The relationship that damaged your heart may never provide proper closure. The unfairness may never balance itself neatly, and this is where many people become trapped emotionally, not only in the pain itself, but in the endless waiting for emotional correction. The mind keeps saying, once they apologize, I can heal. Once life explains itself, I can relax. Once justice happens, I can feel peace. But peace built on those conditions becomes fragile because reality does not always provide emotional resolution on demand. This is one of the hardest Buddhist lessons to accept. Life does not always explain itself, and suffering deepens when peace is postponed until reality behaves according to emotional expectation. Many people unknowingly spend years emotionally frozen because they are waiting for the universe to reverse the feeling of injustice inside them. They want acknowledgement before healing, validation before peace, repayment before release. And while this desire is deeply human, it often becomes another form of attachment. Attachment to fairness, attachment to emotional symmetry, attachment to the idea that pain must eventually be compensated in visible ways before the heart can rest. But reality moves differently. Sometimes good people suffer without explanation. Sometimes cruel people continue living comfortably. Sometimes apologies never arrive. Sometimes misunderstandings remain permanent. Sometimes love disappears without closure, and the mind struggles deeply against these truths because the ego wants emotional completion through external resolution. Yet Buddhism gently teaches that waiting endlessly for life to emotionally repair itself often creates even more suffering. Because now the heart is not only hurting from the original wound, it is also hurting from unmet expectations of justice. This creates a second layer of pain. The first pain says, "This hurt me." The second pain says, "And life still has not corrected it." That second layer often becomes heavier than the first, because the nervous system remains emotionally suspended in unfinished waiting, waiting for fairness, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for the world to finally understand. This waiting quietly drains life from people. There are individuals who cannot fully enjoy the present because part of them is still emotionally standing in front of an old wound, demanding an explanation from existence itself. They replay events repeatedly, hoping to finally discover why things unfolded the way they did. They search for hidden meanings obsessively. They mentally argue with reality. They wait for karma to arrive visibly. And while waiting, years pass. Peace remains postponed. The body remains tense. The heart remains unresolved. Buddhism does not deny the reality of injustice. It simply teaches that attachment to emotional repayment creates suffering. Because the mind keeps demanding something, reality may never deliver in the form expected. This does not mean injustice is acceptable. It means your peace cannot survive if it depends entirely on the universe behaving according to your emotional timetable. That realization can feel painful at first, especially for deeply sensitive people, especially for people who genuinely tried to do good, because part of the heart believes goodness should protect against unfairness, yet life often reveals otherwise. And when this truth first becomes visible, bitterness can easily grow. The mind says, "After everything I gave, this is what happened. After all my kindness, this is what I received. Why do I suffer while others seem untouched?" These questions are ancient. Human beings have wrestled with them for thousands of years. Buddhism does not answer them by promising perfect worldly fairness. Instead, it points toward another possibility: freedom from demanding fairness before allowing yourself inner peace. This changes everything. Because many people unknowingly hand control of their emotional life over to unresolved pain. They tell themselves, "I will stop suffering once they finally understand." But what if they never understand? "I will feel free once they regret losing me." But what if they never regret it openly? "I will heal once life makes this fair." But what if life never arranges fairness in visible ways? Does your peace remain permanently postponed? This is the hidden prison many people live inside. Not only pain itself, but dependency on future emotional repayment. Buddhism gently asks another question. What if peace begins before the apology? What if healing begins before the explanation? What if your soul does not actually need reality to bow before it in order to rest? That question can transform a life, because it returns power inward instead of endlessly waiting outward. This does not mean your pain was imaginary. It does not mean you deserved mistreatment. It does not mean accountability stops mattering. It simply means your nervous system deserves freedom, even if perfect closure never arrives. There is tremendous suffering in constantly mentally presenting your pain to an imaginary courtroom, waiting for existence itself to finally declare you innocent. The exhausted mind says, "Look what they did to me. Look how unfair this was. Look how deeply I suffered." And yes, those things may be true, but endless emotional prosecution rarely creates peace. At some point, the heart becomes exhausted from trying to convince reality to emotionally apologize. Because reality is not a person sitting across from you capable of giving verbal reassurance. Life unfolds through causes, conditions, impermanence, and uncertainty. Sometimes events make sense later, sometimes they never fully do. And one of the deepest forms of maturity is learning how to continue living even without complete emotional answers. This is extremely difficult because the human mind wants narrative closure. It wants a clean story, a villain punished, a victim understood, a lesson fully explained. But life often remains unfinished emotionally. This unfinishedness creates enormous discomfort. Yet Buddhism teaches that peace becomes possible when you stop demanding absolute resolution from an impermanent world. This does not mean becoming passive. It means no longer chaining your inner freedom to impossible emotional guarantees. Many people confuse acceptance with resignation here. They fear that if they stop demanding apologies internally, they are somehow betraying themselves. But releasing attachment to apology is not self-betrayal. It is emotional liberation, because now your healing no longer depends entirely on another person's awareness, guilt, maturity, or conscience. You stop emotionally outsourcing your peace. This is powerful, especially because many people are waiting for closure from individuals incapable of giving healthy closure. Some people lack self-awareness completely. Some people avoid accountability. Some people justify their behavior endlessly. Some people cannot emotionally face the damage they caused. And while waiting for these people to finally awaken, the wounded person remains trapped in emotional suspension. But Buddhism gently reminds us, you do not need another person's full understanding in order to begin healing. You do not need perfect acknowledgement before allowing yourself peace. You do not need life to reverse itself emotionally before you breathe fully again. This understanding creates enormous freedom because it loosens the emotional dependency on external correction. And external correction is never fully controllable. There is another painful truth hidden here. Sometimes the desire for apology is actually the desire to feel seen. The heart says, if they finally apologize, it means my pain mattered. If they finally acknowledge it, it means I mattered. This longing is deeply human. Human beings need recognition, need emotional validation, need understanding. But when validation becomes completely dependent on the person who caused the pain, suffering deepens dramatically, because now your worth feels trapped behind someone else's awareness. This is why self-compassion matters so deeply. Self-compassion says, I know this hurt. I do not need to deny my experience. My pain was real even if others never fully acknowledge it. That inner witnessing becomes healing. Because many people keep waiting externally for validation, they can begin offering inwardly themselves. This does not replace healthy accountability, but it frees the heart from emotional starvation while waiting endlessly for others to finally see clearly. There is also something important to understand about resentment. Resentment often survives because the mind believes letting go means saying the unfairness did not matter. But letting go is not denial. It is choosing not to permanently destroy your own nervous system, carrying unresolved emotional fire. Hatred exhausts the body, bitterness narrows perception. Obsessive unfairness keeps the mind trapped in old pain. Eventually, the person suffering most continuously becomes the one carrying the resentment. Buddhism teaches compassion not because everyone deserves unlimited access to you, but because hatred eventually poisons the one holding it. Compassion here does not mean pretending injustice was acceptable. It means understanding human beings are deeply unconscious sometimes, deeply wounded, deeply reactive, deeply trapped inside their own conditioning. Again, this does not erase accountability, but it softens the endless emotional demand for cosmic revenge before allowing yourself peace. Because revenge fantasies rarely heal wounds, they simply keep the mind emotionally attached to the original pain longer. This is why inner freedom feels so radical. It says, I release myself from endless emotional waiting. Not because life became fair, but because your soul deserves rest too. This shift changes the way you experience suffering. Instead of asking constantly, when will life repay me? You begin asking, how do I care for my heart now? Instead of demanding, when will they finally understand? You begin noticing, what parts of myself still need compassion? Instead of mentally fighting reality endlessly, awareness begins returning to the present moment again. This present moment return is deeply important, because unresolved injustice often traps attention entirely in the past. The body remains here, but emotionally the person still lives inside old injuries, still replaying unfair moments, still imagining different outcomes, still waiting for emotional correction. Meanwhile, life quietly continues moving. Sunlight still enters rooms. Breath still moves. Small moments still exist. Future possibilities still exist. But attachment to unresolved pain makes these things difficult to notice. This is why Buddhism emphasizes non-attachment so strongly. Not because human pain is insignificant, but because attachment keeps attention frozen inside suffering long after the event itself ended. And perhaps one of the most difficult truths to accept is this: life may never fully explain why certain things happened. Some questions remain unanswered. Some losses remain mysterious. Some heartbreak never receives satisfying closure. Some suffering never fits neatly into understandable narratives. The mind hates this uncertainty. It wants resolution desperately. Yet peace often begins the moment you stop demanding complete understanding before allowing yourself to live again. This does not mean you suddenly stop feeling hurt. It means you stop feeding the hurt with endless emotional bargaining, because bargaining is exhausting. The mind bargains with life constantly. If I stay angry, maybe justice will come. If I replay it enough, maybe clarity will arrive. If I suffer visibly enough, maybe reality will finally notice. But reality does not negotiate emotionally that way. At some point, the soul becomes tired. Tired of waiting, tired of fighting, tired of carrying unfinished emotional wars. And that exhaustion can become sacred if it finally leads towards surrender. Not hopeless surrender, peaceful surrender. The kind that quietly says, I may never receive the apology I deserved, and I no longer want my entire life trapped waiting for it. That sentence contains enormous wisdom, because it prioritizes your inner freedom over endless emotional dependency on external resolution. This is not weakness, it is maturity, deep maturity. The maturity to understand that some wounds heal, not because life became fair, but because the heart stopped demanding fairness before allowing itself rest. And strangely, once this attachment loosens, the nervous system begins softening too. The body relaxes more deeply, the mind becomes quieter, the emotional obsession decreases. Not because the past vanished, but because the inner war around the past slowly ended. This creates space for gratitude again, not fake positivity. Real gratitude. Gratitude for breath, for awareness, for the chance to still love despite disappointment, for the possibility of peace despite pain. This gratitude feels different because it no longer depends on perfect circumstances. It grows from acceptance. And acceptance is one of the deepest forms of freedom Buddhism offers. Not freedom from pain entirely, but freedom from endless emotional resistance to reality. And maybe tonight, this is what your heart most needs to hear. You do not need life to kneel before you and apologize in order to begin healing. You do not need every wound fully acknowledged before allowing yourself peace. You do not need perfect justice before resting your nervous system. Your pain mattered, your suffering was real, your heart deserved gentleness, but your future does not deserve permanent imprisonment inside unfinished emotional waiting. At some point, peace begins when you stop asking reality to emotionally rewrite itself before allowing yourself to breathe again. Because life may never apologize the way you hoped, but your soul can still become free anyway. And as the heart slowly stops waiting for life to finally explain itself, another quiet struggle begins revealing itself inside the human experience. Because sometimes the deepest suffering is not caused by the pain itself anymore. It is caused by the conflict between the part of you that is ready to move forward and the part of you that is terrified to let go. Tonight, you are going to understand why the mind often clings to what the deeper self already knows is finished, and why true peace begins when the inner war between holding on and releasing finally starts to soften. There are moments in life when something inside you already knows the truth long before your mind accepts it. You may feel it quietly at night, in the silence after conversations, in the heaviness that appears every time you force yourself to keep hoping, in the exhaustion of pretending something still feels alive when deep down you know it no longer does. Part of you already understands. The relationship is over emotionally. The old version of yourself is gone. The dream changed shape. The season ended. The waiting is draining your spirit. Something inside you already knows. And yet the mind keeps fighting. It keeps replaying, keeps analyzing, keeps bargaining, keeps searching for reasons to hold on just a little longer. This inner conflict creates enormous suffering because the soul begins moving toward release while the mind continues pulling backward. It is like trying to walk forward while emotionally chained to something behind you. Eventually, exhaustion appears. Not only emotional exhaustion, but spiritual exhaustion. The kind that makes even simple moments feel heavy. Buddhism understands this struggle deeply. The mind clings because clinging creates the illusion of control. If the mind keeps thinking about something, it feels active. If it keeps analyzing, it feels productive. If it keeps hoping, it avoids grief temporarily. But awareness sees something different. Awareness notices when attachment has become suffering. Awareness notices when the soul no longer truly wants the thing itself, only relief from the fear of letting go. This distinction matters because many people are not actually holding on to joy anymore. They are holding on to familiarity, holding on to identity, holding on to imagined futures, holding on to emotional habits, holding on to fear of emptiness, and the mind fights release because it fears what comes after letting go. What if nothing replaces this? What if I feel alone? What if I regret releasing it? What if I lose part of myself too? These fears are deeply human. The ego naturally resists endings because endings create uncertainty, and uncertainty terrifies the mind. The mind would often rather stay attached to painful familiarity than step into unknown freedom. This is why people sometimes remain emotionally connected to situations long after the soul has become exhausted by them. A person stays attached to a relationship that no longer brings peace, attached to resentment that no longer serves healing, attached to old identities that no longer fit, attached to pain that no longer teaches anything new, not because the attachment feels good, but because release feels frightening. The strange thing is that the soul often grows tired before the mind does. Something deeper inside begins whispering, "This is hurting you now. This chapter is complete. You do not need to keep carrying this." But the mind argues back immediately, "No, not yet. Maybe things will change. Maybe if I try harder. Maybe if I wait longer." And this internal tug of war can continue for years. The body feels tired, the heart feels heavy, the nervous system feels stretched thin, yet the mind keeps resisting. Surrender. This is one reason suffering becomes chronic. Not because life itself remains unchanged, but because the mind keeps emotionally holding open doors the deeper self is already trying to close gently. Buddhism teaches that attachment often survives through illusion. The illusion that holding on prevents loss. The illusion that clinging protects love. The illusion that endless thinking creates safety. But eventually, awareness reveals another truth. Holding on does not stop change. It only delays peace. This realization can feel heartbreaking at first because many people confuse release with abandonment. They believe that letting go means they never truly cared. But genuine release is not emotional indifference. Sometimes release is the deepest form of compassion possible. Compassion toward yourself, compassion toward reality, compassion toward the truth that forcing what no longer flows naturally only creates more suffering. This is why so many people feel strangely emotional when they finally stop fighting internally. The tears often come not because they suddenly became weak, but because the nervous system is finally putting down a burden it carried too long. The body knows exhaustion before the mind admits it. The soul knows truth before the ego accepts it. You can feel this in many areas of life. A person keeps trying to win approval from emotionally unavailable people, even though something inside already knows it will never fully arrive. A person keeps chasing an old dream that no longer feels aligned because they fear who they will become without it. A person keeps replaying a relationship because the thought of fully grieving it feels unbearable. The deeper self often understands long before conscious acceptance appears, but the mind resists because the mind loves certainty more than freedom. Even painful certainty can feel safer than unfamiliar peace. This is why healing sometimes feels strangely uncomfortable at first, not because healing is wrong, but because the nervous system became accustomed to struggle. A person who spent years emotionally fighting may feel restless when peace finally begins appearing. Silence feels unfamiliar. Stillness feels strange. Calmness feels almost suspicious. The mind asks, "Why am I not worrying? Should I still be thinking about this? Am I forgetting something important?" Because the mind became addicted to emotional activity, and release threatens the identity built around that activity. This is why Buddhism places such importance on awareness rather than force. You cannot violently force the mind into peace. The mind softens gradually through understanding, through noticing, through compassionate awareness of attachment itself. Awareness gently reveals, this constant mental struggle is exhausting you. This attachment is no longer protecting you. This overthinking is no longer creating wisdom. This emotional holding is no longer love. These realizations emerge slowly and often painfully, because every attachment contains emotional investment, time invested, hope invested, identity invested, dreams invested. The ego says, if I release this, what was all that suffering for? But awareness sees differently. Nothing was wasted. Every experience shaped understanding. Every heartbreak revealed truth. Every disappointment deepened awareness. Every ending transformed consciousness somehow. Release does not erase meaning. It simply stops demanding continuation from what already completed its purpose. This understanding creates softness, a softer relationship with endings, a softer relationship with change, a softer relationship with yourself. Many people secretly believe they must emotionally force themselves to let go completely overnight. But Buddhist wisdom rarely works through violence. It works through observation. You notice the suffering created by clinging. You notice the exhaustion. You notice the emotional repetition. You notice the tension inside your body every time attachment tightens again. And slowly, naturally, the desire for peace becomes stronger than the desire to keep holding on. This shift matters deeply because forced release often creates suppression. True release creates spaciousness, a feeling that the inner grip is loosening naturally, not because the memory disappeared, not because the love was fake, not because the pain never mattered, but because awareness finally understands. This attachment is hurting me now. That understanding changes everything. Because once the mind truly sees the cost of holding on, release begins feeling less like loss and more like mercy. Mercy toward the nervous system, mercy toward the exhausted heart, mercy toward the life waiting beyond the attachment. There is another hidden reason the mind resists release. The mind often confuses pain with connection. A person thinks, if I stop hurting, does that mean the relationship meant nothing? If I stop grieving, am I betraying the memory? If I move forward, am I abandoning what mattered? These fears create emotional paralysis. The person remains attached to suffering because suffering feels like proof of love. But Buddhism teaches that attachment and love are not identical. Love can exist without imprisonment. Love can exist without obsession. Love can exist without endless self-destruction. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop turning pain into a permanent residence inside yourself. Because endless suffering does not honor what was beautiful. It only extends inner conflict. The soul often understands this earlier than the mind. Something deeper begins longing for rest, for breath, for stillness, for freedom from endless emotional warfare. And this longing for peace is not weakness. It is wisdom beginning to awaken. There comes a moment where the soul quietly asks, how much longer do we need to carry this? That question can break something open inside a person, because many individuals never consciously examine how long they have been emotionally gripping the same pain. Years pass, sometimes decades, and still the mind repeats the same arguments, the same hopes, the same fears, the same emotional negotiations with reality. Meanwhile, life continues moving, seasons change, the body ages, new moments appear. Yet the mind remains trapped inside old attachment. This creates deep suffering because life naturally wants movement. Everything in existence changes. Breath changes, weather changes, relationships change, identity changes, thoughts change. Nothing remains fixed forever except through attachment, and attachment requires enormous energy to maintain. That is why clinging feels exhausting. It goes against the natural movement of reality itself. Buddhism teaches impermanence not to create sadness, but to create freedom. Because once you deeply understand that all things change, the desperate need to freeze life begins softening. You stop demanding permanence from temporary experiences. You stop expecting certainty from uncertain things. You stop fighting endings as if endings are personal attacks against you. And gradually, the mind learns how to release more gently. This does not happen perfectly. Some days attachment returns strongly. Some days grief rises again. Some days the mind wants to reopen old doors. That is normal. Healing is rarely linear. Awareness simply notices the pattern without becoming consumed by it again. You notice, my mind is gripping again. My fear is tightening again. My attachment is speaking again. And instead of immediately obeying the attachment, you breathe, you observe, you soften. This practice slowly retrains the nervous system. The body learns that release does not equal death. The mind learns that letting go does not erase meaning. The heart learns that peace is possible without endless holding. And eventually, something extraordinary happens. You stop needing to force release. Release begins happening naturally because awareness sees clearly now. The attachment no longer feels nourishing, it feels heavy. The overthinking no longer feels protective, it feels exhausting. The emotional repetition no longer feels meaningful, it feels draining. This clarity creates freedom, not sudden dramatic freedom, quiet freedom. The kind where you suddenly notice the mind is no longer obsessing the way it used to. The memory appears, but it does not completely possess your body anymore. The old trigger appears, but you return to calmness faster. The emotional storm rises, but you no longer drown inside it completely. This is healing, not perfection, not emotional numbness, but less inner warfare, less resistance, less attachment, more space, more breath, more presence. There is also a sacred sadness inside release that many people avoid, because releasing something often means fully acknowledging that a chapter truly ended. No more bargaining, no more fantasy, no more emotional negotiation, just reality. And reality can feel devastating initially, especially when the attachment involved deep love, hope, identity, or longing. But strangely, once reality is finally accepted fully, peace begins entering quietly, because the war ended. The endless internal argument stopped. The nervous system no longer needs to keep defending attachment constantly. This is why surrender feels peaceful after resistance finally exhausts itself. Not because the pain vanished, but because the struggle against truth softened. Buddhism understands surrender very differently from defeat. Defeat says, "I lost." Surrender says, "I stop, fighting reality now." That distinction matters enormously, because many people remain emotionally trapped simply because they interpret surrender as failure. But surrender often becomes the doorway into freedom. Freedom from obsession, freedom from endless replaying, freedom from emotional exhaustion, freedom from trying to force life backward. And perhaps the soul has been longing for this freedom quietly all along, not because it stopped caring, but because it understands something the frightened mind struggles to accept. Peace matters too. Rest matters too. Life beyond attachment matters too. There is still beauty waiting outside the emotional prison of endless holding. Still sunlight, still connection, still laughter, still possibility, still breath, still presence. But the mind consumed by attachment cannot fully see these things because all attention remains fixed on what it refuses to release. This is why awareness becomes sacred. Awareness gently turns your face back toward life itself, not through force, not through shame, but through compassionate truth. The truth that your soul deserves peace more than endless emotional captivity. And maybe tonight, this is what your heart most needs to hear. You do not need to keep fighting internally with what your deeper self already understands. You do not need to keep gripping what is exhausting your spirit. You do not need to remain trapped inside emotional repetition forever. Part of you already knows what no longer belongs in your hands. Part of you already feels how tired the struggle has become. Part of you already longs for rest more than attachment. Trust that part gently, not all at once, not perfectly, but honestly, because the moment the mind finally stops resisting what the soul is ready to release, something beautiful begins happening quietly inside you. The war softens, the breath deepens, the body relaxes, and peace, which was waiting patiently underneath all the struggle, finally begins finding space to return. And as the mind slowly loosens its grip on what the soul no longer wants to carry, another truth quietly begins appearing beneath the silence. Letting go is not the end of suffering. Sometimes the real challenge begins after the loss itself, when the heart must decide whether pain will deepen wisdom or slowly harden into bitterness. Tonight, you are going to understand why loss changes people in very different ways, and how Buddhism teaches the rare art of grieving deeply without allowing sorrow to poison your spirit forever. There are people who lose something precious and become softer afterward, and there are people who lose something precious and become harder. The loss may look similar from the outside. Both hearts break, both people cry, both experience disappointment, grief, loneliness, confusion, or heartbreak. Yet over time, one person becomes more compassionate while the other becomes consumed by bitterness. This difference matters deeply because loss itself is unavoidable in human life, but bitterness is not. Buddhism teaches that suffering can either awaken awareness or strengthen attachment, and one of the greatest dangers after pain is the slow transformation of grief into permanent emotional hardness. Bitterness rarely arrives suddenly. It grows quietly. A disappointment remains unresolved. A betrayal remains unprocessed. A heartbreak remains emotionally active. And slowly, the mind begins building protective conclusions around the pain. People cannot be trusted. Love only leads to suffering. Life always takes things away. Nothing good lasts. Opening your heart is dangerous. These thoughts may feel protective at first, but over time they become emotional walls. The wounded heart stops allowing life to enter naturally, not because it stopped needing love, but because it became terrified of losing again. This is one reason bitterness feels so heavy. It is grief that never fully moved. Grief that became trapped inside resistance, fear, and emotional guarding. Many bitter people are not truly angry at life itself. They are exhausted from carrying unresolved sorrow for too long. Buddhism understands this deeply. The teachings never promise a life without loss. In fact, Buddhism speaks openly about impermanence from the very beginning. Everything changes, everything moves, everything eventually transforms. Relationships change, bodies age, people leave, seasons end, dreams collapse. Nothing remains untouched by impermanence. At first, this truth sounds painful, but hidden inside it is wisdom, because once you stop expecting permanence from temporary experiences, loss stops feeling like a personal betrayal from existence itself. This changes grief completely. The heart still hurts, the tears still come, the absence still feels real, but the mind no longer keeps screaming, "This should not have happened." That scream is often where bitterness begins. Bitterness grows when reality and expectation remain trapped in endless conflict. Reality says, "This ended." Attachment says, "But I needed it to stay forever." Reality says, "This changed." The mind says, "But I wanted permanence." And slowly, sorrow hardens into resentment against life itself. This is why Buddhism teaches acceptance so deeply. Not because acceptance removes grief, but because acceptance prevents grief from becoming permanent inner poison. There is a huge difference between sadness and bitterness. Sadness remains alive. Bitterness becomes emotionally frozen. Sadness still allows tenderness. Bitterness closes the heart. Sadness says, "I loved deeply, and this hurts." Bitterness says, "I will never allow myself to feel deeply again." That difference changes the direction of an entire life, because the bitter heart begins interpreting everything through old pain. New relationships become suspicious. New opportunities feel threatening. New joy feels temporary and unsafe. The nervous system remains guarded even when life becomes gentle again. And slowly, bitterness creates isolation, not only from others, but from life itself. This is why Buddhist compassion matters after loss. Compassion keeps the heart from turning pain into identity. It allows grief without worshipping suffering forever. Many people secretly believe bitterness makes them strong. They think emotional hardness protects against future pain. And yes, emotional numbness can temporarily create the illusion of safety. But numbness also blocks joy, blocks intimacy, blocks connection, blocks peace. A closed heart may avoid certain forms of pain, but it also struggles to fully experience love, trust, gratitude, and presence. This is why bitterness eventually becomes its own prison. The heart spends so much energy trying not to suffer again that it stops truly living. Buddhism offers another possibility. Not naive openness, not pretending loss does not hurt, but remaining soft enough to stay human even after disappointment. This softness is not weakness, it is enormous courage, because after deep loss, remaining gentle requires strength. Remaining compassionate requires strength. Remaining open to life requires strength. Anyone can become hardened by pain. But allowing suffering to deepen awareness instead of hatred is a rare spiritual practice. This does not happen instantly. Loss often arrives in waves. Some days acceptance feels possible. Other days anger returns suddenly. Some days peace appears briefly. Other days grief feels endless again. This movement is natural. Buddhism does not ask people to become emotionless saints overnight. It asks for awareness. Awareness notices when pain begins turning into bitterness. Awareness notices when fear begins replacing openness. Awareness notices when sorrow starts becoming identity. And through awareness, choice becomes possible again. A person begins noticing, I am becoming emotionally closed. I am carrying resentment everywhere. My heart is staying trapped in old pain. That noticing matters, because without awareness, bitterness quietly becomes personality. Some people become so attached to disappointment that they stop remembering who they were before the pain. They introduce themselves to life through cynicism, through mistrust, through emotional distance. The original grief slowly disappears underneath layers of hardness. But underneath bitterness, there is often still sadness waiting to be acknowledged honestly. This is why grief deserves gentleness, not endless suppression, not endless dramatization, gentleness, the kind that allows tears without shame, allows sorrow without self-destruction, allows mourning without permanent hopelessness. Many people never fully grieve honestly because they fear grief will destroy them. So instead, they convert grief into anger. Anger feels more powerful, more controlled, more protective. But buried grief eventually exhausts the nervous system. The body keeps carrying emotional tension long after the original loss. This is why Buddhist mindfulness practices often focus on allowing emotions to move naturally instead of resisting them constantly. A person sits quietly with sorrow, breathes with it, observes it, feels it without turning it into permanent identity. This practice slowly softens emotional rigidity, because bitterness often survives through avoidance, avoidance of vulnerability, avoidance of grief, avoidance of tenderness, avoidance of the raw truth that something meaningful was lost. But healing begins when the heart finally stops running from that truth. Not dramatically, not forcefully, just honestly. Yes, this mattered. Yes, this hurts. Yes, I miss what was lost. That honesty creates movement, and movement prevents emotional freezing. There is another hidden reason people become bitter after loss. Loss often wounds the ego's sense of control. The mind secretly believes, if I love carefully enough, nothing will leave. If I become good enough, life will stop hurting me. If I do everything correctly, permanence will finally arrive. But impermanence touches everyone eventually. No amount of perfection protects against change forever. This realization can either create humility or bitterness. Humility says, loss is part of being human. Bitterness says, life personally betrayed me. The bitter mind personalizes impermanence. It interprets change as punishment. But Buddhism teaches that change is not punishment. Change is the nature of existence itself. This understanding softens suffering tremendously, because now loss stops being evidence that life singled you out unfairly. Instead, loss becomes part of the shared human condition. Everyone loses eventually. Everyone grieves eventually. Everyone experiences endings eventually. This realization creates compassion, not only for yourself, but for others too. You begin seeing that behind many harsh people is unresolved sorrow, Behind many angry people is unprocessed grief. Behind many emotionally distant people is fear of loss. Pain shapes human behavior constantly. This awareness does not excuse harmful actions, but it deepens understanding. And understanding prevents hatred from fully taking root. This matters because bitterness often isolates people emotionally. The bitter person says, "Nobody understands. Nobody cares. Nobody can be trusted." And slowly, loneliness deepens. But compassion reconnects the heart to humanity again. Compassion says, suffering touches everyone. Fear touches everyone. Loss touches everyone. This shared understanding softens emotional separation, not because pain disappears, but because isolation decreases. Buddhist teachings often emphasize loving kindness for this reason. Not sentimental positivity, genuine goodwill toward yourself and others despite imperfection. Loving kindness becomes especially important after loss because grief naturally narrows awareness. Pain makes the mind focus entirely on absence, entirely on what disappeared, entirely on what ended. But loving kindness gently widens awareness again. You begin noticing beauty that still exists. Breath still exists. Sunlight still exists. Connection still exists. Peace still exists in moments, not to erase grief, but to remind the heart that life did not end entirely with the loss. This balance matters deeply. Some people become afraid to experience joy again after loss because joy feels disloyal to grief. They think, if I laugh again, I am forgetting. If I feel peaceful again, maybe the loss did not matter. But healing does not dishonor love. Bitterness dishonors life far more than peace ever could. A person who loved deeply can still smile again, can still feel warmth again, can still experience meaning again, not because the loss vanished, but because the heart slowly learned how to carry sorrow without becoming consumed by it. This is one of the deepest Buddhist practices, holding grief gently instead of turning it into permanent emotional armor. Armor seems protective at first, but armor also blocks touch, blocks tenderness, blocks life. Many wounded people secretly long for connection while simultaneously protecting themselves against it constantly. The nervous system remains prepared for future pain, prepared for abandonment, prepared for disappointment, but this constant preparation creates chronic tension. The body never fully relaxes, the heart never fully opens, life becomes emotionally distant. Buddhism invites another way of living, not reckless vulnerability, wise openness, the understanding that pain may come again someday, yet life is still worth meeting with presence instead of permanent fear. This perspective changes everything, because now love becomes an experience to appreciate, not a possession to control forever. Moments become precious because they are temporary. Connection becomes meaningful because it changes. Life becomes vivid because it cannot be frozen. Impermanence stops being only tragic. It also becomes what makes existence sacred. A flower matters partly because it does not bloom forever. A sunset matters because it fades. A conversation matters because moments pass. This understanding softens the desperate need to control life completely. And when control softens, bitterness softens too. Because bitterness often grows from demanding permanence from impermanent things. The Buddhist path gently teaches, love fully, grieve honestly, accept change, remain soft, continue living. This path is difficult, very difficult, especially after deep loss, but it creates inner freedom. Freedom from emotional imprisonment, freedom from endless resentment, freedom from becoming hardened permanently by pain. And perhaps one of the most beautiful truths hidden here is this: the heart can break without becoming ruined. A person can lose deeply without losing their humanity. A soul can grieve honestly without turning cold forever. This is rare wisdom, the wisdom of remaining compassionate inside an impermanent world, the wisdom of allowing sorrow to deepen tenderness instead of destroying it, the wisdom of understanding that bitterness is not proof of strength. Peace is, because bitterness keeps the wound alive endlessly. Peace allows the wound to breathe, and slowly, over time, what once felt unbearable becomes something quieter, not forgotten, not erased, but integrated. Part of the story without becoming the entire story. This is healing, not becoming untouched by pain, but becoming less afraid of life because of pain. And maybe tonight, this is what your heart most needs to hear. Loss does not have to turn you bitter in order to prove it mattered. You do not need to harden your soul to survive grief. You do not need to close your heart forever to protect yourself from impermanence. You are allowed to mourn honestly while still remaining open to life. You are allowed to miss what ended while still embracing what remains. You are allowed to carry sorrow without carrying hatred beside it. Because the deepest form of strength is not becoming emotionally untouchable. It is learning how to keep your heart gentle in a world where everything eventually changes. And as the heart slowly learns how to carry loss without becoming hardened by it, another quiet misunderstanding begins revealing itself underneath so much human suffering. Because many people are not only hurt by disappointment itself, they are hurt by what they believe disappointment says about them. Tonight, you are going to understand why the mind so often turns ordinary human disappointment into proof of personal inadequacy, and how Buddhism teaches a gentler way of meeting failure, rejection, and unmet expectations without losing yourself inside them. There are moments in life that seem small on the surface, but quietly shake a person's entire sense of worth. A message goes unanswered, a relationship ends, an opportunity disappears, a dream fails, someone else gets chosen, plans collapse, and almost instantly the mind asks a painful question: what does this say about me? This question creates enormous suffering because the human mind constantly personalizes disappointment. Instead of seeing disappointment as part of life's uncertainty, many people interpret it as evidence of their inadequacy. A failed relationship becomes, "I was not lovable enough." A rejection becomes, "I was not valuable enough." A mistake becomes, "I am a failure." A closed door becomes, "There must be something wrong with me." And slowly, disappointment stops being an experience and becomes identity. This is one reason people suffer so deeply, not only because life disappoints them, but because they turn disappointment into a verdict about their worth. Buddhism teaches something profoundly healing here. Events happen, conditions change, outcomes unfold. But the mind adds identity to these experiences afterward. The pain of disappointment is natural. The belief that disappointment defines your value is added suffering. That added suffering becomes heavy over time, because human life contains endless uncertainty. Not every effort succeeds, not every relationship lasts, not every dream unfolds the way you hoped, not every season brings visible reward. And if every disappointment becomes proof of unworthiness, inner peace becomes impossible. The nervous system remains trapped in constant self-measurement, always scanning life for evidence of inadequacy, always comparing, always fearing failure, always trying to protect identity from disappointment. This creates deep exhaustion. Many people do not realize how much of their emotional pain comes from the constant interpretation of events rather than the events themselves. Two people can experience the same rejection. One says, "This hurts, but life is uncertain." The other says, "This proves I am not enough." The external event may be identical. The internal suffering becomes completely different. This is why awareness matters so deeply in Buddhism. Awareness notices the stories the mind creates after disappointment. It notices how quickly the ego personalizes pain, how quickly it turns temporary outcomes into permanent identity, and once this process becomes visible, freedom begins, because now you can separate what happened from who you are. This distinction changes everything. A relationship ending means the relationship ended. It does not automatically mean you are unworthy of love. A career failure means something did not work. It does not automatically mean you are worthless. Someone not choosing you means they made a choice. It does not automatically define your value as a human being. Yet the mind collapses these things together constantly. This happens partly because the ego wants certainty. It wants clear explanations for pain. And self-blame often feels emotionally simpler than uncertainty. If something failed because I am defective, then at least the mind believes it found an answer. But reality is rarely that simple. Life unfolds through countless conditions. Timing matters. Circumstances matter. Compatibility matters. Other people's consciousness matters. Luck matters. Emotional readiness matters. Impermanence matters. Buddhism teaches interdependence for this reason. No single outcome fully defines an entire human being. Everything arises through many causes and conditions interacting together. This understanding softens the ego's desperate need to turn every disappointment into personal condemnation. Because many painful outcomes were never entirely about your worth to begin with. Some relationships fail because two nervous systems cannot meet safely. Some opportunities disappear because timing changes. Some dreams collapse because life redirects growth elsewhere. Some disappointments simply reflect impermanence itself. Yet the wounded mind interprets everything personally. This personalizing becomes especially strong for people who learned early in life that love or worth depended on performance. A child praised only when succeeding may grow into an adult terrified of disappointment. A child criticized constantly may interpret every setback as confirmation of inadequacy. A child who learned to earn affection through achievement may experience failure as emotional collapse. And slowly, disappointment becomes emotionally dangerous. Not because disappointment itself destroys people, but because identity becomes fused with outcomes. This is why some individuals cannot rest after setbacks. Their nervous system treats disappointment like proof of unworthiness instead of part of human life. The body tightens, the mind spirals. Shame appears immediately, not just sadness, not just frustration, shame. And shame says, this happened because there is something fundamentally wrong with me. Buddhism gently interrupts this voice, not by denying pain, but by reminding you that suffering does not equal identity. A difficult experience does not summarize your entire existence. You are larger than one outcome, larger than one chapter, larger than one rejection, larger than one mistake. This perspective creates space inside the mind. And space matters, because without space, disappointment immediately becomes self-destruction. Many people are far harsher toward themselves than reality itself ever was. A small mistake becomes endless self-attack. A rejection becomes proof they should stop trying entirely. A failed attempt becomes a reason to emotionally punish themselves for years. This inner cruelty deepens suffering dramatically, especially because life already contains enough difficulty without the mind adding endless self-hatred on top of it. Buddhist compassion becomes essential here. Compassion does not say disappointment feels good. Compassion says, you are still worthy of gentleness even when things do not go as planned. This is difficult for many people to accept, because modern culture often teaches conditional worth. Perform well and you matter. Achieve enough and you deserve rest. Succeed visibly and you deserve love. But Buddhism teaches that worth is not something earned through perfect outcomes. Human beings are already inherently vulnerable, imperfect, changing creatures. Disappointment is part of being alive. Failure is part of learning. Loss is part of existence. No human escapes these things completely. And once this truth is deeply understood, disappointment stops feeling like evidence of personal defect. Instead, it becomes part of the shared human experience. This understanding creates humility, not humiliation. Humility says, I am human. Sometimes things fail. Sometimes life changes direction. Sometimes effort does not guarantee outcome. That perspective softens the nervous system enormously, because now the body no longer needs to interpret every disappointment as emotional catastrophe. There is also another hidden suffering many people carry. They secretly believe disappointment should not happen if they are spiritually good, emotionally aware, kind enough, or hardworking enough. But life does not function like a reward machine distributing perfect outcomes to deserving people. Even wise people experience disappointment. Even loving people experience rejection. Even compassionate people lose things. This does not mean life is cruel. It means life is impermanent, uncertain, complex, and deeply beyond total control. The ego resists this truth because the ego wants guarantees. It wants to believe perfect effort creates perfect safety. But Buddhism teaches freedom through acceptance instead of control, not passive surrender, clear seeing. The understanding that disappointment belongs to life itself, not to your personal failure alone. This changes how the heart responds after setbacks. Instead of immediately collapsing into shame, awareness begins asking gentler questions. What can this teach me? What conditions contributed to this? What expectations was I attached to? How do I care for myself now? These questions create growth instead of self-destruction. Because the goal of awareness is not perfection. The goal is wisdom, and wisdom rarely grows through self-hatred. Many people secretly believe self-criticism motivates growth, but harshness often creates paralysis instead. The frightened nervous system becomes afraid to try, afraid to risk, afraid to fail again. This fear slowly shrinks life. The person stops attempting things not because they no longer care, but because disappointment became emotionally unbearable. This is why Buddhist non-attachment matters so deeply. Non-attachment does not mean you stop caring about goals, relationships, or dreams. It means your identity no longer completely depends on specific outcomes. You can work hard without collapsing if things change. You can love deeply without turning rejection into self-erasure. You can hope sincerely without emotionally dying every time life redirects you. This flexibility creates resilience, not rigid toughness, flexible resilience, like bamboo bending during storms instead of snapping. Rigid identity breaks easily under disappointment. Flexible awareness adapts. This adaptation is one of the deepest forms of inner freedom, because now disappointment becomes information instead of condemnation. A relationship ending may reveal incompatibility instead of unworthiness. A failure may reveal timing issues instead of personal defect. A setback may reveal redirection instead of permanent defeat. This does not erase pain, but it removes the extra suffering created by self-judgment, and self-judgment creates enormous suffering. Many people spend more energy attacking themselves after disappointment than they spent experiencing the disappointment itself. The event happens once, the mind punishes endlessly afterward. This punishment often comes from unconscious beliefs learned long ago. If I fail, I lose love. If I disappoint people, I lose value. If I make mistakes, I become unacceptable. These beliefs create deep fear around ordinary human imperfection. But Buddhism gently reminds us that imperfection is not failure of existence. Imperfection is existence itself. Everything changes, everything remains incomplete, everything evolves continuously. No human being becomes permanently flawless. And perhaps freedom begins the moment you stop demanding impossible perfection from yourself before allowing yourself compassion. There is another hidden problem with personalizing disappointment. It creates comparison constantly. The mind says, they succeeded, so why not me? They were chosen, so what is wrong with me? They found happiness, so why am I struggling? Comparison deepens suffering because it removes context completely. You compare your internal pain to another person's visible outcome. But every human being carries invisible conditions, fears, timing, struggles, and karmic paths you cannot fully see. Buddhism teaches mindfulness partly because comparison pulls attention away from direct experience. The comparing mind never rests. It constantly measures worth externally, but external outcomes fluctuate endlessly. If identity depends entirely on success, praise, or achievement, inner stability disappears whenever life changes. This is why Buddhist teachings emphasize inner awareness instead of external validation. Because external validation is temporary. Praise changes, opinions change, outcomes change, but awareness remains available underneath all changing conditions. This awareness creates grounding. The grounded person still feels disappointment, still feels sadness, still feels frustration, but they no longer interpret every painful event as proof of personal defect. That distinction changes emotional life completely. The nervous system relaxes more easily. The mind becomes less catastrophic. The heart remains softer after setbacks, and gradually courage returns. Because people stop fearing disappointment as total emotional annihilation. They begin understanding, I can survive unmet expectations. I can survive redirection. I can survive not being chosen. This understanding creates confidence far deeper than arrogance ever could. Arrogance depends on winning constantly. True confidence survives imperfection. True confidence survives uncertainty. True confidence survives disappointment without losing self-respect entirely. This is one reason Buddhist wisdom often appears calm, not because enlightened people never experience setbacks, but because they stop treating impermanence like personal failure. A storm arrives, a chapter ends, a plan changes, and awareness responds with less resistance, less identity collapse, less emotional warfare. This does not mean becoming emotionally numb. It means remaining compassionate toward yourself inside changing circumstances. There is tremendous healing in learning how to disappoint yourself without abandoning yourself. This is a skill many people never learned. They learned achievement, performance, perfectionism, people-pleasing. But they never learned self-compassion during imperfection, so every disappointment becomes emotional exile. The person withdraws love from themselves the moment they struggle, but Buddhist compassion remains present even in failure, especially in failure, because suffering already hurts enough without self-rejection added to it. This is why gentleness matters so deeply. A gentle mind heals faster than a brutal one. A compassionate nervous system adapts better than a shamed one. And perhaps what many people truly need after disappointment is not harsher discipline, but wiser understanding. The understanding that life-changing direction does not erase human worth. The understanding that outcomes do not fully define identity. The understanding that imperfection is woven into existence itself. And maybe tonight, this is what your heart most needs to hear. Disappointment does not mean you are broken. Rejection does not mean you are unlovable. Failure does not mean you are worthless. Sometimes things simply unfold differently than the mind hoped. Sometimes life redirects you. Sometimes timing changes. Sometimes impermanence moves through your plans. And none of these things erase your humanity. You are allowed to feel sadness without turning sadness into shame. You are allowed to grieve unmet expectations without deciding you are inadequate. You are allowed to fail without abandoning yourself emotionally, because your worth was never meant to depend entirely on whether life unfolded perfectly. And the moment you stop treating disappointment as proof that something is wrong with you, suffering begins loosening its grip around your heart. And maybe that is the deepest truth hidden inside all of these teachings. Peace was never going to come from controlling every outcome, changing the past, forcing people to become different, or making life unfold exactly the way you hoped. Real inner freedom begins the moment you stop fighting reality and start meeting life with awareness, compassion, and acceptance. Tonight, you learned that pain does not have to become your identity. Disappointment does not define your worth. Loss does not have to make you bitter, and closed doors are not proof that you are broken. You learned that some things cannot be changed, but your relationship with them can. And sometimes that changes everything. The mind may still wander back to old wounds sometimes. That is part of being human. But now you know how to return. Return to the breath. Return to the present moment. Return to the quiet understanding that peace does not come from rewriting life. It comes from finally allowing life to be what it is without losing yourself inside it. Before you leave,